Discover why samurai carried ornate folding fans into combat and how this seemingly ceremonial object was actually one of their most versatile battlefield weapons. Chapter 1. The Glimmer of Steel. The cool morning air flowed through the half-open sliding shoji doors of the main dojo of the Sato clan, carrying with it the penetrating smell of damp earth, old pines, rotting leaves, and the inevitably approaching winter that would freeze the blood of even the most battle-hardened warriors. The fog, thick and heavy like sour milk poured onto the rough, uneven surface of a huge oak table, loomed very low over the finely raked gravel of the vast courtyard, slowly swallowing the outlines of the stone lanterns and blurring the boundary between the brutal world of the living and the dark, silent realm of ancestral spirits. The interior of the huge dojo was immersed in a stark, monochromatic twilight, where each shadow cast by the pillars seemed to be sharpened like a razor, ready to cut through the fabric of reality. Heavy clan banners hanging from the sky-high ceiling, faded by the inexorable time and marked with traces of old, forgotten battles, fluttered silently in the wind, and their only eye-catching color accent was a single, faded red of the clan coat of arms, resembling a lonely drop of congealed blood on an endless canvas of hopeless gray. The atmosphere in this place resembled a frame frozen in time from the darkest legend, in which the tension is so thick and palpable that a skilled craftsman could cut it into slices with his sword. The thick oak floorboards, polished to a shine by decades of bare feet of thousands of adepts training here, and brutally marked by deep scratches from countless training blows of bokken swords, emitted a quiet, deeply resonant sound with every, even the smallest and most careful movement. This grim place was a true, ancient temple of iron discipline and physical pain, a monumental altar on which young adepts offered their sweat, blood, and tears every dawn in a bloody sacrifice to the merciless gods of war. In this austere, absolutely uncompromising environment, where overwhelming black and cool white dominated all other colors, the only microscopic source of light were the rare, weak rays of the slowly rising sun, which with great difficulty penetrated the leaden clouds, casting long, geometric, rib-like stripes of pallor on the worn dojo floor. The stagnant air was filled with the pungent smell of sweat, the special camellia oil used to carefully preserve fine steel and old rotting wood, a scent that to every warrior gathered here and breathing heavily was an absolute synonym of home, strict duty, and the constant, desperate fight for physical perfection. This space, huge, overwhelming, and causing agoraphobia in the weak in spirit, seemed to breathe its own slow, almost beastly rhythm, patiently waiting for the spark that would ignite the fire that consumed everything. Every single pillar supporting the roof, huge, smoke-blackened, and covered with rough knots, was a silent witness to the birth of great legends and the pathetic falls of the weak. And the silence that reigned here was not a sign of the longed-for peace, but an extremely darkly charged pause before the inevitable, catastrophic outbreak of violence. In the very pulsating heart of this gloomy temple of shadows, moving with the incredible grace of a predator and the destructive, unstoppable force of a storm approaching from the ocean, young Kenshin trained, an outstanding, awe-inspiring phenomenon, the praises of which would have been sung in the farthest corners of neighboring provinces were it not for the extremely strict and rigorous rules of the Sato clan requiring absolute modesty and humility. Kenshin was a walking, breathing embodiment of deadly perfection, his lithe body, slender, devoid of even an ounce of excess fat, but sculpted with an iron, stone hardness from years of murderous training, instantly reacting to every, even the smallest, impulse of his focused mind with the speed of striking lightning. In his strong, calloused hands, the katana was not just a soulless tool forged from carbon steel by a craftsman, but became a natural, organic extension of his own arm, an animated, bloodthirsty entity that cut through the humid air with a high, piercing, and whistling sound, reminiscent of the agonized cry of a bird of prey diving for its prey. The blade of this magnificent sword, polished over generations to such an extent that it perfectly reflected every tiniest ray of incoming light like vibrating liquid silver, created a luminous, deadly halo around its figure, blurring into a blurred, hard-to-see streak with each lightning-fast slash and powerful block. With almost arrogant confidence, Kenshin performed the most complex and dangerous kata with his eyes closed, and his bare feet glided across the freezing cold, uneven boards with flawless mathematical precision, making almost no sound, as if he were floating millimeters above the ground. He was the absolute prodigy of the entire Sato clan, their greatest hope for survival in these dark times, and the sharpest, deadliest weapon they had ever had in their arsenal. Thick sweat beaded profusely on his pale forehead, glistening in the cold, merciless morning light, while his own breathing remained unwaveringly regular, very deep, and completely 100% controlled by his indomitable will. The dark, rough silk of the sword's traditional braid quickly absorbed the moisture of his clenching hand, providing a grip so incredibly secure that even a direct blow from a heavy blacksmith's hammer to the blade could not dislodge the weapon from his grasp. His numerous peers, gathered at a safe distance on the outskirts of the designated training mat, watched him in complete silence, with a strange mixture of deep, sincere admiration, deep-hearted jealousy, and pious, even religious reverence, forgetting about their own fatigue. For them, this young man was no longer just a colleague from the Kenshin dojo. He had become an almost descending earthly deity of war, who appeared among mortals only to show them what the absolute, unattainable peak of perfection in ancient martial arts looked like. His every move, even the smallest one, was terrifyingly precise. In this killer choreography, there was no room for any unnecessary gesture, for a moment of weakness, or a split second of hesitation. He struck at his imaginary, invisible opponents with such unimaginable fury, passion, and perfect accuracy that onlookers standing around could almost see in their mind's eyes heads falling to the ground and blood spraying onto the walls. The cold metallic gleam of the black lacquered hard parts of his training armor contrasted beautifully with his almost aristocratically pale skin and jet black hair slicked back and tied in a traditional bun. Right now, Kenshin was a vortex of pure destruction incarnate, confined only to a fragile, in a fluid, water-like movement almost imperceptible to the untrained human eye, Kenshin, without any warning, moved from solitary, individual meditative forms to direct, extremely brutal sparring with the three oldest, most experienced students of the entire dojo, who, at his barely perceptible signal, charged at him with unbridled fury, raising a lung-rending battle cry. Three heavy boken swords made of hard red oak cut through the dense air at great speeds simultaneously, aiming directly at Kenshin's head, exposed torso and legs in a perfectly, almost telepathically synchronized, deadly dance of destruction that would blow a normal warrior to shreds. However, where these merciless blows should have easily found soft flesh and shattered bones, they meant only a void of swirling air or the hard, unyielding block of his weapon. Kenshin quickly lowered his position, almost touching the cool floor with his right knee, and from the perspective of the observers lying on the mats, he seemed to grow larger at that moment, magnifying his striking, monumental silhouette against the gloomy background of the stark, ribbed ceiling. With a terrible, dry crack that resembled the breaking of thick human bones, his boken with incredible, explosive force repelled the brutal blow coming from the right, and then in a split second, without losing any momentum, Kenshin spun smoothly on his heel, perfectly using the mass of the attacking opponent to deliver a devastating yet perfectly controlled blow straight to his exposed ribs, knocking the wind out of him.
Fine dust and microscopic splinters of wood immediately rose up, vibrating in the air and creating a kind of blizzard suspended in time in the shafts of pale light cutting through the darkness, as another of the powerfully built attackers furiously tried to strike a murderous blow from above with the intention of splitting his skull. Instead of dodging, Kenshin did not flinch at all under the pressure. On the contrary, with the brutal, terrifying grace of a wild cat, he stepped decisively straight into the dangerous range of the enemy's weapon, powerfully knocking his wooden blade aside, and in the same split second, stopping the tip of his own deadly sword just a millimeter from the opponent's pulsating throat. The thick air in the spacious dojo seemed to thicken and freeze at that moment, and time itself stopped completely for that one infinitely long moment. Around the fighters there was an absolutely monochromatic world of various shades of gray and pitch black, in which the only violent flash of any color were the faces of his determined opponents, heavily reddened by superhuman effort and lack of oxygen, and the dark red patent inserts of their leather protectors shining in the twilight. The third and final attacker, having hesitated only a heartbeat after the sudden and brutal fall of his older comrades, made the most fatal mistake. He allowed icy fear to creep into his usually calm mind and paralyze his muscles. Kenshin sensed this immediately, and with the instincts of a predatory wolf with a dark, cruel glint in his eye, he leapt at the terrified student in two very long, springy strides, making a series of feints so incredibly fast and deceptive along the way that the carved wood of his sword spun in the air like a mill wheel, finally and irrevocably knocking the weapon out of the defender's hand with a powerful, precise blow to the weave of the wrist that caused a dull cry of pain. This entire complicated multiplayer fight lasted from start to finish in just a dozen or so violent seconds, and its carefully executed choreography was so brutally brutal, merciless, and mathematically perfect that it resembled a decisive.
The echo of the last loud crack of the intersecting wooden swords slowly but inexorably died away under the extremely high and dark ceiling of the dojo, slowly giving way only to the heavy whistling and hoarse breathing of the finally defeated students, who with great difficulty picked themselves up from the hard, cold floor, hissing in pain and rubbing their newly acquired painful bruises on their trembling limbs. At the same time, young Kenshin stood absolutely unmoved in the very geometric center of the mat, resembling a statue of a deity carved from the hardest granite, his chest rising at the pace, and his breathing was exactly as calm and regular as before the beginning of this exhausting, murderous fight, which testified to his superhuman condition. With an extremely satisfying, loud, and metallic click, which was reminiscent of the final closing of a large, heavy lock in a prison cell, with a confident and practiced movement, he sheathed his many-notched training sword behind the thick cotton obi belt, and this characteristic dry sound echoed off all the wooden walls of the building, sounding to the ears of those present like an irrefutable, final verdict issued by the highest judge. Seeing that the sparring was over, all the remaining young and old adepts, gathered in silence on the edges of the shaded courtyard, lowered their heads in sync in a very deep, reverent, traditional bow, which in their fearful execution bordered not only on the recognition of someone's superiority, but on absolute, almost slavish obeisance worthy of a divine ruler. Hushed whispers full of unconditional adoration, tinged with a thick note of hidden fear of his skills, quickly ran through the gathered crowd like a gusty autumn wind rushing through a field of withered, rustling rice, carrying with it words of appreciation and disbelief. Kenshin, however, accepted all these tributes due to him not with the humility and modesty required by the restrictive Bushido code, but with the dangerously cold, calculated arrogance of an autocratic tyrant who, in his opinion, only with indifference takes from his subjects what is objectively due to him due to his genius. His upright, proud posture was a living manifestation of absolute, unwavering self-confidence, a confidence that had long since crossed that very thin, barely visible line separating great, awe-inspiring mastery from disastrous, bottomless pride. In the vast and acute mind of the warrior, there was simply no room for the slightest doubt or self-criticism, and he was completely serious about the absolute, unquestionable, and final pinnacle of human martial evolution, a being of an entirely higher order who had been magically fashioned from pure fire, tempered steel, and the will to destroy, and before whom all other humans living on Earth were but shapeless, soft, useless clay waiting to be molded. The remnants of adrenaline still coursed intensely through his veins, pumping into his nervous system a sense of complete, absolute invincibility, and increasing the dangerous false belief that no military force, no master, no clan on this earth was or ever would be able to successfully stop the deadly dance of his perfect blade. He was now looking at his lying companions, moaning softly and breathing hard from above, through slightly narrowed, cold eyelids, dispassionately analyzing their stumbles and shortcomings in technique with the analytical coldness, devoid of any empathy, of a perfect predator assessing the helplessness of the prey he had just hunted. To him, even the most complex movements of these people were woefully predictable from the very beginning, irritatingly slow and full of critical, easily exploitable flaws. Standing there in the haze of sweat and dust, he could clearly feel every cell.
In the most distant and darkest recesses of his complicated soul, young Kenshin had a hard, ruthless, and invulnerable to any logical argument's belief that the absolute only real power, the only objective and indisputable truth in this fragile world, filled with lies and politics, rests solely in the thin, perfectly sharpened, and ice-cold edge of the samurai sword, ready at any moment to cut through human life like the wind cuts a spider's web. For him, the widely understood philosophy worshipped in the clan, complex poetry, calligraphy, and flowery court intrigues were nothing more than dangerous illusions and smokescreens deliberately created by weak, useless people in order to effectively hide from the world their pathetic incompetence on the battlefield, pathetic lack of courage and panic, uncontrollable fear of coming death at the hands of the stronger. The world, according to Kenshin's strict doctrine, was by its very nature a brutally and beautifully simple arena of survival, ruthlessly divided between the dominant victors and the brutally eliminated victims, the few who determinedly hold the silk-bound hilt of their weapon, and the pathetic, whimpering majority who must ultimately bleed to death on the former's polished blade. In his black and white perception of reality, there were no so-called shades of grey. There was absolutely no room for shameful compromise, complicated diplomacy, or weak alliances. There was only one perfect and fatal cut that ultimately and irrevocably determined everything that had any value in life. Kenshin, in his arrogant, implacable thoughts, often vulgarly mocked and openly mocked the boring, outdated teachings of the old great masters, whose treatises he was forced to study every day, and who naively preached about the need to achieve balance, spiritual harmony with the forces of nature, and utopian defeat of overwhelming enemy forces without having to draw weapons. With unwavering confidence, he dismissed all this as senile, sentimental nonsense uttered by bitter men whose bodies had simply become flabby with age and whose minds had become dull and murderous over time. He asked himself a rhetorical question in his mind. What is this famous harmony when a powerful enemy is standing directly over your defenseless neck with an exposed blade, ready for a murderous blow? What is the dreamed utopian peace propagated by monks and rulers, if it is not just a very short logistical break to drag the corpses out of the river and sharpen the swords chipped in the previous clash on the stones? His innate and carefully cultivated arrogance was not loud, flashy, or cheaply boastful like that of drunken tavern ronin. It was extremely quiet, unimaginably deep, and absolutely deadly to those around him, extremely firmly and permanently rooted in his complete, almost fanatical belief in his own physical supremacy over any opponent. Soulless, cold steel was basically the only powerful god he prayed to, silently in the dark of the night, and it was a ruthless deity that never demanded blind faith, promises of improvement, or sterile meditation from its follower, but demanded endless sacrifices of human blood, absolute precision of action, and unbridled brutal physical force to take lives. When, coldly calculating the distance to the defeated with his eyes, he very gently and with disgust brushed a small, barely visible to others, speck of grey dust from the dark, fight-scented sleeve of his elegant, expensive kimono, this seemingly insignificant gesture became a perfect, extremely accurate metaphor for his entire attitude to the rest of the world around him, without the slightest hesitation.
When the exhausting and extremely physically intense morning training finally came to an end and the attention of the enthusiastic trainees, tense of his string, slowly but with relief began to dissipate in search of respite, Kenshin's eagle-eyed and unblinking gaze, which was still filled to the brim with the dense, predatory tension looking for prey, unexpectedly and quite lazily wandered towards the extremely wide, vast wooden veranda called Engawa, tightly surrounding and protecting the eastern, brightest side of the monumental dojo building. There, in complete, almost unreal detachment from the omnipresent smell of pungent sweat, hysterical screams of fighters, and the brutal, overwhelming kinetic energy that had just moments ago filled and electrified the main hall so intensely, completely alone and motionless like a statue, sat Lord Ishikawa, the chief advisor and eminence grise of the clan. The hard-to-imagine, powerful contrast and emotional dissonance between these two closely adjacent but so different and alien worlds was so drastic that it irresistibly resembled a brutal, destructive head-on collision of two completely different, mutually exclusive historical eras in the history of the Empire. This entire scene, taking place in silence before the warrior's eyes, abundantly bathed in the harsh, merciless, colorless light of the misty morning, looked at that moment like an amazing, masterfully and geniusly composed ukiyo-e woodcut, in which very sharply and clearly, in the loud foreground, the untamed, dark, and very aggressive force of youth embodied by an excited Kenshin, and far away, in the foggy background, undisturbed and undisturbed by anything, there reigned the absolute, unshakable, and almost mystical peace of an old man lost in his own thoughts. The thick early morning fog, which was slowly and reluctantly giving way to the crisp, razor-cutting air outside the building, in a very unnatural, even magical way, seemed to part with reverence and awe in a semicircle around the ascetic figure of the chief advisor, as if Mother Nature herself was humbly and silently giving him his rightful place on earth, noticing the greatness of this man. Old Lord Ishikawa, widely known as a ruthless, brilliant strategist and a great veteran of countless monstrously bloody military campaigns from an era whose grim names and terrifying casualty counts had long and permanently passed into legends told around campfires, now looked from a distance, in the eyes of ignorant youth, as a man downright morbidly and painfully fragile, almost made of transparent, cracking glass. Modestly, yet elegantly dressed in heavy, layered, and very dark robes made of extremely luxurious, but clearly faded and worn silk, he sat in a perfectly symmetrical, completely and absolutely still traditional seiza position, with his knees spread wide apart like the roots of an old tree, keeping his posture stable. His slow, calm demeanor, as calm as a dead lake, was a perfect, almost textbook embodiment of absolute distance and emotional alienation from the surrounding, noisy and trivial clan reality. He was the only one among those gathered who never even once, during the heaviest exchanges of blows, honored this extremely bloody and unmistakably brutal display of swordsmanship and physical strength with even a single, passing and curious glance.
He behaved exactly as if all these amazing and universally feared feats of a young, maddeningly talented warrior were to him just an insignificant, ignored by design, fleeting gust of warm wind playing with the blades of grass, or a lonely, invisible cicada aimlessly playing its repetitive melody in the stifling.
The camera of slow and precise observation, carried out with an extremely cold and ruthless subjective perspective of Kenshin himself, and resulting directly from the natural rhythm of the dark narrative of this morning, full of hidden tensions, carefully built in his imagination, gradually and inevitably moved closer and very smoothly to the silent figure of the old man sitting nearby in the shadow. However, Kenshin's sense of sight, sharpened to its limits, ruthlessly and with surgical precision, passed with great indifference his senile face, covered with extremely deep wrinkles and sunken eye sockets, resolutely concentrating his entire and undivided attention completely and exclusively on the fascinating phenomenon of his strange, calmly lowered hands, registering their every detail with an almost cinematic, clinical, and soulless detail that knows no compromise. Certainly, and without any doubts, for a reliable and experienced observer, from the first glance, even a very cursory one, it was possible to say without hesitation, and with a huge degree of probability, that these were once the hard and merciless hands of an old man who, in his incredibly and surprisingly long life, full of various tragic experiences and bloody battles, literally and figuratively went through with his own eyes and with his own hands, and in full consciousness experienced a real hell in our deserted land. Merciful gods of the earth, hands that were completely, irreversibly, and very brutally ruined by the turmoil of war, fires, frosts, cuts of enemy steel, and falls from a running horse. The outer, hardened and insensitive skin on them, which was a kind of historical, terrifying archive, was tightly covered with an incredibly dense, incredibly complex network of dozens of very deep, hard and slightly shiny in the twilight, pearl-white traces of old scars caused by other people's weapons, and this network looked up close like strange topographic maps, disturbing in their brutal nature, commemorating the course of generations long gone and happy for the present, forgotten by all the war conflagration from the Eastern Front from half a century ago. The thick, completely faded and calloused in many places tissue on these tired hands was downright hard, like an old scroll of parchment, forgotten for years and mercilessly dried out from the ashes, inscribed with secret death sentences, and permanently, unnaturally to the point of absurdity, twisted in very strange directions by progressive and very painful arthritis, and numerous crooked, without the help of a good doctor, damaged phalanges connected with old fractures, clearly and with great determination, testified to several dozen long, extremely brutal and physically terrifying years of constant cramping, blind with fear, wielding a damn heavy two-handed sword and a crushing metal pike in battle. And all this undoubtedly took place in the most cruel, unworthy of man, and without a trace of mercy, extreme and blood-curdling weather conditions, in mud mixed with snow, opponent's intestines, and his own body secretions, which altogether went far beyond the limits of the human and military imagination of the young man now looking at and analyzing these hands. However, in this disturbing phenomenon, it was surprisingly not the tragedy of this unmistakable and striking, even monstrous distortion of the anatomy of these aged hands so strongly, magically, and almost hypnotically for incomprehensible reasons, that attracted the greatest and absolute attention of the cynical and indifferent warrior. Oh no, it was this extraordinary gentleness and delicacy that struck him so strongly and with complete conviction, this extremely incredible, unheard of, and seemingly completely impossible in its human nature, Kenshin's eagle-eyed gaze, which had been fixed very intensely and constantly for a long time, even staring with merciless fixation and unblinking at the silent, seemingly inconspicuous figure of this small, mentally alienated and indifferent to noise old man, darkened dangerously and visibly in a split second with an exceptionally expressive, unconcealed and strikingly direct contempt for this man shown to everyone, and towards weak pacifism. In a very strange, completely uncontrollable reflex, the left corner of his normally pursed, thin and merciless mouth lifted up, almost by a micrometer, in a slightly hidden, very malicious, and even extremely mocking asymmetrical grimace of disappointment, full of internal, deep and sharp disgust. This involuntary, treacherous expression on his face, which in truth he had so incredibly quickly and cleverly covered with an impassive and cool stone veil of self-possession, was so wonderfully camouflaged and deeply protected from the watchful and weakness-seeking surveillance of all the rest of the remaining, silent before him, the rest of the gathered there, staring attentively the students and experienced masters of lower rank. But deep under this cover, at the very bottom of his quivering, spoiled by the vanity of a young warrior of an outstanding level and a completely merciless psyche, very dangerous, even with a powerful and loud bubbling avalanche of darkness, slowly boiling with a loud hiss the insane desire to attack, and a terrible, uncontrolled, wild and loud explosive fury without any restraint. This disgusting darkness, hidden behind the ribs, was fueled by a very thick and dangerously viscous mixture unknown to the human, rational and logically balanced mind, resulting undoubtedly from pure, even boorish egocentrism, complete to the core, lacking even a fraction of compassion, respect, or the simplest humanistic and philosophical understanding in the world for the attitude of the old man, who undoubtedly conflicts with the vision of an ideal leader in times of crisis. In his perception of the art of conducting public affairs, completely distorted by cruelty, extremely simplified and devoid of subtle multi-dimensional perception, for Kenshin, objectively this is in fact beautiful, delicate and defenseless, highly decorated with flowers and birds, an amazing artistic masterpiece, in all its incredibly and damn amazing intricacy, with strikingly beautiful traditional calligraphy drawn with gold thread and soft Japanese paper handmade by masters in the areas of the imperial capital, was indisputably, in short, only and only the worst and cheapest pity, a ridiculous, completely kitschy and ruthlessly objectively useless piece of trash women's fashion accessory. According to his exaggerated optics of war, it was the most embarrassing shit, in extremely shameful and useless from a military and defense perspective, a terrible joke on serious veterans, and above all, a sad relic with distorted foundations, pulled like a disgusting corpse straight from the ancient, irrevocably permeated with decadence of monstrous cowardice and unimaginably disgusting, dangerously effeminate, carefree life of the spoiled, the intrigues of loud politicians and conciliatory officials in the splendid palaces of the distant capital, and this rotten zone of decadence absolutely certainly, according to his unquestioned doctrines here, did not in the slightest degree have the right to exist, to be brought and manifested here, far from the poems and right in the midst of the seriousness, in the extremely unrelentingly bloody and full of painful daily contact with death, merciless, cold and cruel to the point of toothache, murderous and monstrous in crimes, a world of dismembered corpses of great warriors, in which the strongest, as a rule, brutally dominated, striking repeatedly with iron swords those who had committed the stupidity of not grabbing the hilt in the when the silent and full of mockery from the outside, long-lasting thoughts of the impudent Kenshin, full of testosterone, very slowly left the sphere of objective and easy-to-confirm prosaic thoughts running quickly along the cobblestones. They quickly and flawlessly slid with the speed of an avalanche of lava down to an even more dangerous, extremely radical, and very deeply located in the corrupted subconscious perception, even morbidly darker, hostile to the core, destructive and paranoid thought patterns fueled by the extreme arrogance of an outstanding individual. With each passing second, he began to subconsciously build a dark monument to his own and only glory based on ruthless disgust toward the senile, tired veteran, making sure of his conviction and belief in the divinity of his ideals higher than those of the rest of society. His monstrous and hidden deep in the dark recesses of psychology contempt for the objectively exemplary and old-age pacifist and very silent display of physical weakness manifested in the form of small and silent repairs of a silently damaged prop was extremely tangibly driven with terrifying engine dynamics to the disturbing and disastrous sense of unrestrained, hostile frustration flowing endlessly from the false perception of a powerful, toxic by definition, the samurai's belief in limitless intoxication, like a wonderful opium, with the feeling of absolute and completely in one's own calculations, unquestioned by any living being, imaginary but strong in instilling the superiority of a being with a divine and superhuman genesis, perceived through the mirror of evil existential assumptions, distorted by egocentrism. Without any mental hesitation, in his camouflaged and thoroughly dark internal dialogue revolving around the assessment of the strategies of the region's management, he blamed one sweeping and completely erroneous, incompetent cut of harsh assessments and brazenly and firmly rejected the entire old concept of basing the nation's power on respect, consisting in a very precise and painstakingly built long-term, a wise political strategy of states which has its roots firmly established for the elites and flawless at its core. Firmly rooted in fear-cool patience for a wounded soldier, many months of painstaking and meticulous to the point of boredom, precise, multi-level wise observation, and conciliatory, prudent, eloquent diplomacy, which usually saves many thousands of civilian lives, which according to him, by design, pitifully and unnecessarily wasted the vital forces of the reserve army for defeating a weak rival, and which this pathetic and old advisor clearly symbolized, simply considering them by definition in their ferocity as stupid, ineffective, and objectively pathetic for the enemy army, excuses that meant the absolute victory of the stronger one, justifying the worst of the worst, lamenting the death of the worst, the cowards unable to defend themselves, running with their eyes pleadingly fixed upwards, waiting for a stab in the back to shorten it faster, previously imagined tortures, next to screams to the pain caused by an irreversible and sharp incision of cold sheet metal, forged by easily paid armorers. The true great art of military strategy destroying state structures of defense, he often repeated breathlessly in the silence of his own dialogue of dark thoughts, completely reflexively with a huge dose of aggression, with all his strength, involuntarily and uncontrollably, slowly tightening to the pressure of huge tensions on the phalanges with a huge loud crunch of the joints, inexorably tightly gripping the wide, cold snake, wrapped thickly in expensive coarse silk, decoratively framed with brass, the hilt of a wonderful, restored old father's sword, deadly and smooth with a disturbing longitudinal scratch, is to attack mercilessly by the impudent.
suddenly, in a completely unexpected and terrifying way, reminiscent of the violent impact of a great earthquake, in a downright vulgar and gross way, physically hitting the marrow of the bone like a sharp spear piercing a paper shield. The mourning pacifist, incredibly silent, meditative, and completely unrealistic for the audacious warrior, calm and balanced to the point of madness atmosphere, and the omnipresent, thick and stuffy, subconsciously permeated with disgust in the forgotten sanctuary, with the strong scent of many years of stubbornly applied beeswax, and the sweat evaporating around the aura of the dojo, muted due to the lack of screams, were abruptly interrupted and mercilessly, monstrously, explosively, with one noise, loudly, with great difficulty and haste, ruthlessly, physically torn apart in all dimensions into thousands of bleeding shreds, dirty spots of dust, of collapsing nothingness. Just 100 meters long piece of darkness from the cool courtyard, beating loudly with a great rumble repetitively from outside, in front of the courtyard, very clearly and quickly reached the ears, incredibly cruel in objective dark and sharp, powerfully felt audibly, a very restless, filthy, and extremely violent out-of-anger drum noise of a loud, unmistakable by the soldier strongly and disturbingly putting big huge to the power screwed up disorderly, with quick and greedy steps, cruelly high up and irregularly uplifting crunch of blindly trampled, silently running away from the destruction of small thousands of refined pieces of decorative, very reliable and expensive, specially formed and white, beautiful gravel inherent in the decoration of courtyards, of ceremonial manners and garden surroundings. This was ruthlessly played out with a loud, dull, crackling sound at the bottom that was terrifying in fear, so unbelievably irritating to the senses, cuttingly damned, exaggerated and chilling in its sound, crunching in this closed, hallowed by pacifism, empty, large, closed, completely indifferent, silent temple of the dojo, with all its vibrating clarity, immediately reminding the trapped fear of panic, drawn with rough fury, fast, brutal, driven desperately and blindly to the power-failed defense, cruelly desperate scratching resistance, and clenched scratching sound, reminiscent of scratching with the bleeding long nails of a hanged man, the dying remnants of the floor of the tombs with nails against the coarsely ground sharp edges, cool, bottomlessly silent, indifferently casting echoes, solid and large, grave, black, vibrating loudly, unyielding, unworked and murderous, like an old axe from the great past centuries, a cracked ancient stone of a great destroyed pagan tube for murderers from the distant islands of the bay, cutting off the flow of the northern ocean. Exactly after only the passage of a barely noticeable, incredibly loud, silent and incredibly endless waiting for the viewer, a short moment, like a hasty drawing of a sword, of a great irreversible impact and a crucial moment, extremely pregnant from the point of view of historians, of significance for the escaping sentence, by the violently struck under pressure, opened, thrown away with a thoroughly painful crack, helplessly stripped, struggling, wobbling, weak at the threshold, unfolded with a great echo, unconsciously falling with an impact, decorative white traditional sliding doors of a huge building, thin sliding screens made of thin Japanese rice white, smoothly in the wind cracking the delicate shoji at the bottom, dangerously, just like a thrown, rushing bullet fired hard and unconsciously from a loaded musket tube. With an uncontrollable scream and clatter he fell, knocked down and stumbling, sliding through a brutally blood-chilling entrance to the safe, shaded and rigor-protected center, a gloomy clan messenger, dirty in blood, bringing terrible terror after corpses to the camp from the east. His arrival into the arena was objectively reflected
The voice of a terrified fugitive from the east in the uniform of a clan messenger, lying on the mud-damaged floor, lying in a terrible and uncanny tone, with a terrible and uncanny tone, when, with great ruthless anger from his throat soaked in blood, and finally, with effort, choking the remnants of his bursting breaths in the mud on the boards, he finally managed to escape from the collapse of inarticulate shock that chilled and paralyzed the entire body, loudly, violently, with a silent screaming, terribly at the top of his voice, tearing the constricted ears of the gathered people, terribly in pain, in fear, exhausted, speaking louder, screaming and wheezing on fractions of a breath of bloody phlegm, spitting ichor around, in isolation, tearing, screaming in agony, was now an infinitely indescribable effort, incredibly unrelenting, and in a way that was terrifying, chilling with panic, totally ruthless, worn out, dry to the point of loss of limits, dried out and down to crumbling in fractions, terribly dangerous in words, cruelly cracking for all listeners, brittle, interrupted in breaths, exactly like finally destroyed, crumpled, forgotten in the frost, weathered, thrown and battered from the mud, insanely hard, crumbling, thrown from the floors, incredibly cracking, old, torn, unknown, dead, thrown out of rage, rotten from years ago, high on dust jacket, dry, old and torn, oblong on a torn roll, thrown a scroll in the archive, parchment that makes no sense, holds no words, covers up the shadows from the old era, forgotten decrees, great mad death-defying decisions for the army, for dead troops, to stop the carnage of the war which is completely collapsing behind the walls, from the ruins, with enemies from the west cutting everything down, blunt as a razor, iron craftsmen, huge in strength, merciless, huge blows bared mightily in shame and chilling blades, as if in a shout of cruel, shouted executioners under the black banners of an army without honor, desperately and harshly spat out in the dust of the floor, with a choked echo of hopelessness, words devoid of any refinement in tone, from the fallen messenger's mouth twisted with fear, with the terrible weight of the inevitable, uttered trembling in pain, with a huge loudness for the surroundings, in breathless screams, hoarse on the edge of soundlessness, with a terrible loud scream and the clatter of falling despair, unbearable to the great ear, desperate, inert, wheezing, hard to swallow, pain absolutely with impetus and without warning, powerfully in the ears, deafening, extremely painful, murderous for stability, hit with a crash of inevitable loud striking echoes, and simply humiliatingly overpowering, uncontrollably like a big loud murderous tearing apart the walls of the dojo, a rain with a diameter of hail falling on the exposed field of the fugitives' boulders, large, cold, hard, repeatedly cutting, destructive, ruthless, in flight, splitting against walls, hard, sharp along the way, cruel at the top, at the bottom, cutting, heavy in impact, on armor, cold and large, with an impetus, gray, falling without warning, with an impact without a mountain, huge stones, monstrous, without hesitation, for the weak, cruelly falling incessantly onto broken shields, finally and to the end, with the enormous force of madly cutting, cold, loudly falling lead bullets, completely without any hesitation, without mercy, absolutely and ruthlessly, mercilessly in fractions, with extraordinary passion, completely and permanently at the bottom, tearing apart, destroying, exposing the defenseless at the top, completely crushing hopelessly to the core, the smallest, worthless, blurred in panic, weak to the absurd, defenseless for a great fire, miserable in protection, small, invisible, absolutely pacifist remnants, infirm, miserable, pathetic, objectively for the enemy infantry, crushed illusory crumbs of a safe grate a few minutes ago, pacifist and very quiet, shown by the old with respect, deceptive, incompetent, stupidly carefree with smooth pacifism, wasted and hopelessly lied to, slowly put to sleep with.
A wave of the monstrous in tears, cold in the inside, humiliating to the bones, paralyzing for the heart, totally cruel to the core, even incredible on the outside and deep above in the minds, sharp, merciless, down to murderous, running away, deaf under the eyelids, tearing the lungs for crying, mad completely in the mind, absolutely boundless, tearing down the walls, choking the fall and screaming in silence from below, the inevitable freezing at the bottom loud, terribly loud, with paralysis, choking in tears and falling, humiliating to shame, from below, blind from destruction, cruel, cutting across throats, incapacitating from impact, blind at the top, rough in the lips, on the breath, and from the depths of absolutely cold, cruel and hopeless, from confession, chilling the blood from heart to the core, to the power, through and through, incredibly piercing for every powerful person, from the panic of the sentencer, and incredible without mercy and shock, vibrating deaf and hopeless, with absolute power knocking you to the ground, ultimate paralyzing to madness, fear with absolute screaming, cutting on the spine very cold and completely devoid of regret from the impact, limitlessly unyielding, brutally tearing with great power at the head, absolutely destructive, extremely insensitive and ruthlessly merciless, powerfully falling on heads inwards, brutal, cruel to the defense with measure, mad in tears, tearing hearts in oppression, terrifying for a warrior, paralyzing to the point of losing one's breath, to crying like a mindless person upon impact, madly loud, unrestrained, absolutely brutally cold and terribly tearing, erupting cruelly from the mountains, unimaginably and terrifyingly deadly, choking, murderous, foaming from the flood, mad, destroying in the valley, incredibly dangerous, deaf, powerfully cutting without pardon, brutally and cruelly in the loudness, and untamed without limits, swiftly murderous rush to destruction, loud choking about death, current absolutely deaf, and in the fog mad with the force of exploding, great rushing, choking powerfully cold, hard smashing, cutting monstrously wide choking, objectively from the escapes of the inevitable, deadly cold cutting, foamy tearing against boulders, rushing with a huge roar, terrifyingly deadly, hitting the death insensitive rocks, boulders, choking, rushing, madly cold current striking the deaf, untamed current of an icy river in a monstrous freezing howling gale, chilling with the absolutely limitless resistance of rushing water at the bottom, in the middle, in a deafening monstrous slaughter after the mad frost, a massacre on pacifism, a mighty massacre from the shadows in a cruel, objectively choking up to the ears, mercilessly cutting powerfully in the cold, about the absolutely powerful, with a snowstorm tearing without interruption into a bloody scream from the corpses gone mad, absolutely, totally overpowering the great, cruel to inertia about death, the middle about the unimaginable howling from the shadows, death destructive about the fall to zero, death deadly in the loud, breathless, brutal, absolute choking completely about the massacre of the monstrous, great choking, cold, deadly in the death, with fear choking from the enemy hands, in the middle, absolutely cruel and totally murderous, deadly in the screams of the blind, absolute inexorable in death choking, brutal in fear, with a heart attack hitting the dark winter time in the shadows, horror from hunger, death in the monstrous, in destruction, in the freezing objectively mad, cruelly to the defenseless suffocating indifference in the camps, death great and deadly without mercy, humiliating without slaughter, cruel falling about without mercy, destructive, choking with fear from fear, absolutely cold
slaughter in the middle of cold, in the corpses cutting, cruel, suffocating slaughter, in a monstrous slaughter to the naked mortal, to death, to flights in madness, cruel without choking, cruel at the core, to the fall of the great fallen, with fear, death in the frost, a monstrous massacre, about death to paralysis, a humiliating storm, without salvation from the slaughter, about the mad in destruction, objectively.
While cruel, merciless, and paralyzing fear coiled like a poisonous snake around the hearts of other students, in the young and extremely bold, even arrogant Kenshin, it caused completely opposite effects and feelings bordering on psychopathic euphoria with a dark shade of madness in the joy of slaughter at the base of the waiting crowds in the circles of enemy infantry without escape, choking bloody battles with a smile, chilling in the desire to wait for an attack on destruction from the overpowering attack of the cruel great lust in the furious battle, cutting without hesitation from the falling blow in the screams without escapes, from the overpowering cruel terrible in the screams of death to the absurdity of the great outstanding wild in the joy of the lust for murder without remorse, cruel from waiting silent blind for death, powerful in anger for slaughter with a smile, in the slaughter of the mad absolutely cruelly without borders to the horizon for the great in the fall, explosive, bloody, mad, cutting to tears the joy of the fight, to the destruction, cutting in the screams of the falling without mercy, the attack of the cold in the smile of the mad, cruel, choking, to escape for the victims, wild in amuck, incapacitating from the cruel, humiliating battle in the blind, in great fear, to the falling blow in the cruel for the crowd, monstrous, choking expectation carnage, in an attack cruelly great, powerful for madness, with an explosion, deadly, choking, cruelly savage, with deadly euphoria, slaughter, in a monstrous fall, explosively bloody slaughter, with madness, with a blow, deadly, choking, with fear, cruel slaughter, from the shadow of monstrous, cruelly, with a smile, choking, blindly, mad, cruelly, cutting for mercilessly overpowering great euphoria in madness, overpowering death without escape, cruel about the mad at the scream of the powerful choking, about the bloody overpowering in euphoria, about the chilling howl from the attack of murderous joy in the fall of the monstrous absolute, cruelly cutting in the fear of the blind mad at the deadly wild, in the destruction choking in the mercy of the slaughter, cruel in the euphoria from the mighty chilling falling in the blind at the attack, with about death striking monstrous, oh cruel to the enemy, mad with choking, incapacitating attack, cutting to slaughter, joyful in a smile, freezing after blows, powerful in destruction, striking about death, oh euphoria in bloody to the point of absurdity, fallen, chilling about mortal, about the fall, wild, choking about the joy in waiting for the slaughter, in the cruel blind, about silent until the fall, oh in the destruction of the blind without escape, of terrible fear, in euphoria, in the death, powerful, cruelly for the enemy, wild with satisfaction, choking, cruel madness with the deadly silent, joyful, in murderous joy, in the attack of the great, choking, incapacitating, after the slaughter, in the fall of the wild with monstrous joy, of the attack on the cutting, chilling of the euphoria of the slaughter in the fall of the blind, savage, with choking about the attack of the powerful, about the deaf in the cruel attack from the slaughter, on the bloody from choking in the bloody powerful to the deadly slaughter, overpowering joy of slaughter in the cruel great choking from euphoria, murderous with blows of the monstrous savage joy of slaughter.
In a mind corrupted by war, Kenshinat raged absolutely loudly about a powerfully cruel and completely maddened, deathly powerful without mercy, about the slaughter of the imagination, about the excruciating without fear, about the chilling joy from the idea of death in the cold with suffocating, in the monstrous, overpowering, absolute blind, in the fall for the victims of the battle, powerfully without fear, in the wild outstanding completely destroyed by the impact cutting loudly, in a powerful imaginary in madness, cruelly choking from fear to the blood, in a battle incapacitating without destruction,
cruelly about a powerfully cruel battle in a freezing mad slaughter. We about a powerful within joy for you a deadly battle in euphoria, about explosive with blows cruel to the enemy, in choking in an attack deadly, overwhelmingly monstrous, with a great choking with cruel from the battle to the fall in the euphoria. O bloody from the cruelly blind to the choking about the deadly in the slaughter, overpowering on the attack, powerfully in the fall, cruelly freezing from about the battle outstanding, in the smile, overpowering cruel in the deadly, in the mighty choking slaughter about the mad in the euphoria, with the great chilling about the choking, O the mightily blind to the fall from murderous fear, O within you a smile, choking terribly, cruelly, immortal, O with an overpowering attack you in joy, in battle, chilling, O cruelly powerful to the fall of the blind from fear in choking, O bloody slaughter in overpowering monstrous, O powerful cruelly chilling in euphoria of the mad, O with mortal choking in joy, in attack blindly in slaughter, O a smile cruelly overpowering to you in the choking monstrous with the battle in the mighty murderous choking, O fatally in the slaughter in the cruelly mad overpowering carnage, in the chilling, O in the joy of the attack choking powerfully, in the blind, in the euphoria murderous cruelly in the smile, O with the deadly in the slaughter overpowering in the monstrous to the fall battle mightily, within cruelly mad choking with joy, in a chilling attack of deadly in a blind slaughter, O in an overpowering euphoria powerfully in a smile murderous cruelly, O choking, O fatally in a slaughter a monstrous battle from attack to fall overwhelmingly overpowering, in a cruel choking in joy mad in a powerful O a deadly chilling slaughter, a blind in euphoria O a smile overpowering choking about the murderous slaughter, powerful in the cruel to the fall fatally about the monstrous that from the attack in the joy of the battle, overpowering in the choking cruelly in the mighty madness, about the deadly freezing slaughter in the euphoria, about the blind in the smile overpowering, choking about the murderous powerful in the slaughter to the fall, cruelly about the monstrous deadly from the attack that, in of joy, in an overwhelmingly suffocating battle, in a mighty cruelly about a chillingly mad mortal slaughter in euphoria about the blind, in a smile chokingly incapacitating, mightily in a murderous until the fall slaughter cruelly about a monstrous, in a mortally from attack in joy, in a suffocatingly dementedly mad in euphoria slaughter about blind, choking in a smile, powerfully overpowering to the fall in a murderous and cruel slaughter of a monstrous, in a deadly attack, in joy, in a choking, cruelly overpowering in a powerful and chillingly deadly in the euphoria of a mad slaughter.
While the brutal audacity from the attack, Kenshin was already vibrating to the brim with an excess of cruel, blindly overpowering, choking lust, in a deadly, cruel, and demented about the slaughter, powerfully overpowering to the choking, in the powerful, cruelly about the freezing in euphoria, about the deadly madness in the smile of the blind slaughter, about the choking, overpowering, powerfully in murderous, to the fall slaughter, cruelly, about the monstrous in the deadly with the attack in the joy and the choking overwhelmingly the battle, cruelly in the mighty with the chilling mortal mad in the euphoria slaughter, with the blind choking in the smile incapacitating powerfully, to the fall in the murderous, cruelly, the slaughter of the monstrous in the deadly with the attack in the joy and the choking, cruelly overpowering in the powerful, about the chilling mortal in the euphoria of mad slaughter. The old distinguished adviser, absolutely slowly on mute, brilliantly, precisely, silent, calmly and majestically died, in absolute harmony on the pacifist, beautiful, silent, small, silk-shining fan, the last saving small for art, red brilliant, from tying shining brilliant and masterfully made not with pacifistic grace, for the first time raising his brilliantly composed gaze and meeting
representing the mad desire, murder, agitated, full of predatory and shallow fire, empty, cold, blind pupils of an arrogant adept, which forever wiped out two absolutely irreconcilable, by definition, opposition, extremely different, gigantic, irreconcilable, completely opposite in the universe, life truths and dilemmas, leaving a great void in the darkness of the shadows of the wonderful dojo, and giving, at the beginning of the cruel history of the rushing military campaign, a huge, deep symbolic dimension that cut through the observer's senses.
Chapter 2. An Old Man's Shadow.
The command tent was a suffocating cavern of shadows and stifling heat, illuminated only by the erratic, flickering glow of charcoal braziers that cast long, distorted silhouettes against the heavy canvas walls. Kenshin knelt on the woven rush mats, his posture rigid, his muscles coiled tight like a spring, ready to snap, fully anticipating the glorious assignment that his years of brutal, relentless training had earned him. Outside, the violent, howling wind of the approaching storm whipped the clan banners into a frenzy, their desaturated crimson fabric providing the only bleeding splash of color in an otherwise bleak, high-contrast, monochrome world of ash, mud, and iron. He imagined the vanguard, the chaotic, blood-soaked front lines where a samurai forged his legend through the precise, devastating application of cold steel, where the air tasted of copper and fear. Instead, the grizzled commander, his face a map of deep scars and harsh lines illuminated by the underlighting of the brazier, delivered a decree that struck Kenshin not with the honorable force of a blade, but with the dull, humiliating thud of a wooden practice sword. He was not to ride with the vanguard. He was to be sequestered within the safe, heavily fortified walls of the inner keep, assigned as the personal, shadow-like bodyguard to Lord Ishikawa, an elder statesman whose days of legendary conquests were buried deep in the dust of a bygone era. The words echoed in Kenshin's mind, a repulsive mantra of degradation, as the hot blood rushed to his ears, drowning out the ambient sounds of the war camp outside. His fists clenched involuntarily, the thick, hardened leather of his arm bracers creaking loudly in the oppressive silence of the tent, a stark physical manifestation of his boiling, barely contained rage. He felt as though a magnificent, razor-sharp nodachi, polished to a mirror finish and thirsty for battle, had been callously repurposed to chop firewood or slice soft tofu for a peasant's meal. The sheer, unadulterated disrespect of the assignment gnawed at his pride, tearing away his visions of glory and replacing them with the suffocating reality of becoming a mere nursemaid to a withered relic of the past, a task that required none of his lethal speed, his tactical brilliance, or his ruthless efficiency in ending human life. As he rose to his feet, bowing stiffly to mask the venom in his eyes, Kenshin stepped out of the tent and into the harsh, swirling grit of the encampment. The biting wind immediately assaulted his face, mirroring the cold, bitter resentment that had firmly taken root deep within his warrior's soul, a festering wound of bruised ego and shattered expectations that would only grow more painful with each passing day of his humiliating servitude. The humiliation settled over him like a heavy, waterlogged wool cloak, dragging down his spirit as he made his solitary, agonizing walk through the sprawling, chaotic war camp toward the inner citadel. Everywhere he looked, he saw the stark, gritty reality of men preparing to meet their destiny, a cinematic tableau of high-contrast life and death painted in shades of charcoal and bone. Samurai squatted by roaring fires, meticulously applying whetstones to their katanas, the rhythmic metallic rasping sound grating against Kenshin's frayed nerves, reminding him of the violent symphony he was being denied. Ash from the forge fires fell from the iron-gray sky like morbid snow, coating the rough, trampled mud of the thoroughfares and settling onto the gleaming, overlapping plates of Kenshin's lacquered armor, dulling its intimidating luster. He was a creature born for the storm, molded by years of ascetic discipline and bone-breaking combat drills to be a harbinger of sudden, terrifying violence. Yet here he was, walking away from the crucible of honor. The sidelong glances of his peers, whether real or entirely imagined by his bruised ego, felt like tiny poisoned darts piercing his armor, their unspoken whispers accusing him of inadequacy, of being deemed too soft or too unstable for the true rigors of the front line. He observed the chaotic, visceral textures of the camp, the coarse frayed ropes securing the supply wagons, the splintered wooden hafts of the yari spears stacked against the palisades, the rough, calloused hands of the Ashigaru infantrymen binding their straw sandals. All of these raw, tactile elements of war were being stripped away from him, replaced by the impending prospect of perfectly raked gravel, manicured bonsai trees, and the stifling, incense-choked air of the Elder Lord's private quarters. Kenshin's jaw clenched so tightly, his teeth ground together, his mind violently rejecting the profound waste of his extraordinary talents. He was a predator being forced into a gilded cage, an eagle commanded to walk among the sluggish, earthbound tortoises. The massive, iron-studded wooden gates of the inner castle loomed ahead, a towering, impenetrable barrier separating the visceral, bleeding reality of the samurai's true purpose from the sterile, stagnant existence of political maneuvering and elderly convalescence. As the heavy wooden doors groaned open to admit him, Kenshin felt a profound sense of claustrophobia wash over him, the dark shadows of the gatehouse swallowing him whole, symbolizing his descent into a suffocating, deeply resented irrelevance. His first true encounter with Lord Ishikawa did absolutely nothing to assuage the inferno of impatience and disgust raging within Kenshin's chest. If anything, the visual confirmation of the man's profound frailty only poured oil upon the flames. The setting was an agonizingly tranquil, perfectly ordered inner garden, a stark, almost offensive contrast to the chaotic, mud-soaked war camp Kenshin had just left behind. Ishikawa sat upon the deeply grained, beautifully polished wooden ngawa, the veranda that wrapped around the main estate, his ancient withered form wrapped in layers of worn, albeit incredibly fine, muted silk robes that seemed to swallow his slight frame. The old lord's face was a topographical map of extreme age, deeply grooved with ravines and valleys that spoke of countless decades of harsh sun and harsh decisions, yet his eyes were closed in serene, infuriating repose, completely oblivious to the turbulent, violent world churning outside the castle walls. Kenshin stood a respectful distance away, positioned perfectly in the background, like a rigid, unfeeling statue of dark iron and coiled hostility, his sharp eyes scrutinizing the man he was meant to protect with his life. He saw no trace of the legendary demon of the battlefield that the elders spoke of in hushed, reverent tones. He saw only a crumbling ruin, a man whose bones looked.
Thus began the excruciating, mind-numbing routine of the Shadow's duty, an existence characterized by endless hours of following Ishikawa through the labyrinthine, softly lit corridors of the vast castle grounds, an exercise in sensory deprivation and psychological torture for a young warrior bred for explosive action. Kenshin matched his pace to the agonizingly slow, deliberate, shuffling steps of the Elder Lord, feeling his own highly conditioned leg muscles cramp and protest against the unnatural, stifling restraint required to walk so hesitantly. The visual landscape of his new life was dominated by the stark, beautiful, but utterly lifeless interplay of light and shadow, a masterful chiaroscuro cast by the sun filtering through the delicate paper of the shoji screens, projecting sharp, geometric prison bars across the smooth, cold tatami mats. Kenshin existed in a state of hyper-awareness, his highly tuned senses constantly probing the silence for threats that did not exist.
He reacted internally to every subtle creak of the floorboards, every distant rustle of silk, every shifting shadow cast by the wind-blown branches outside, his adrenal glands constantly primed but never allowed to release. This perpetual state of unfulfilled readiness was exhausting, a slow, grinding erosion of his spirit that left him feeling hollowed out and incredibly irritable. Ishikawa, in stark contrast, seemed to float through the estate with the slow, unbothered inevitability of a creeping glacier, frequently pausing for interminable minutes to observe the subtle curve of a ceramic tea bowl, or the exact placement of a single, fallen crimson leaf upon the dark, damp earth. Kenshin watched these displays of contemplative stillness with a growing acidic disdain, viewing them as the pathetic, meaningless preoccupations of a mind that had completely lost its edge, a warrior who had surrendered his fangs for the soft, useless comforts of aesthetics. As an oppressive, chilling fog began to roll in from the surrounding mountains, bleeding into the courtyards and blurring the sharp architectural lines of the fortress into soft, ghostly smears of gray, Kenshin felt his own sense of purpose dissolving with it. He was a lethal instrument of war slowly rusting in the damp, heavy air of disuse, forced to tread silently behind a man who no longer inhabited the brutal reality of the samurai, his silent footsteps echoing the profound, hollow tragedy of his immense, wasted potential. The true depths of Kenshin's frustration began to crystallize around his observations of a singular, specific object, the heavy, iron-ribbed Tessen fan that Lord Ishikawa carried with him at all times, a formidable weapon of war that the old man utilized in the most staggeringly mundane and insulting ways imaginable. The first distinct incident occurred in the meticulously maintained rock garden, a stark, minimalist expanse of pristine, raked white gravel, punctuated by dark, jagged boulders that resembled islands in a frozen, monochromatic sea. Ishikawa had paused his slow progression, his eyes narrowing slightly as he observed a microscopic irregularity in the sweeping parallel lines of the gravel, a flaw entirely invisible to Kenshin's combat-focused gaze. Slowly, with an agonizing lack of urgency, the old man withdrew the closed Tessen from his obi sash. Kenshin's eyes immediately locked onto the object, recognizing the dull, cold glint of the solid iron outer spokes and the intricate, masterfully applied black lacquer that covered the heavy metal. This was a tool designed to shatter collarbones, to parry the razor edge of a swinging katana, to crush a man's windpipe in desperate close-quarters combat. Yet Ishikawa merely extended the heavy iron instrument, using the cold metal tip to point out the errant pebble to a deeply bowing, terrified gardener. The sharp, authoritative snap of the fan striking the air sent a jolt of pure, unadulterated disgust down.
The desecration of the iron fan continued unabated, further fueling the furnace of Kenshin's silent, seething anger during a particularly stifling, humid afternoon spent inside the dim, claustrophobic confines of the estate's private tea room. The air was thick and heavy, saturated with the overwhelmingly pungent, earthy aroma of burning sandalwood incense that seemed to coat the back of Kenshin's throat and make his eyes water. The heat was oppressive, pressing down on them like a physical weight, drawing beads of sweat that slowly tracked down the rough, scarred texture of Kenshin's face and pooled uncomfortably beneath the heavy, lacquered plates of his formal armor. He stood perfectly still, his posture an unwavering testament to his iron discipline, but his mind was a chaotic tempest of irritation and discomfort. Across the small room, seated comfortably on a plush silk cushion, Ishikawa exhibited none of the rigid stoicism expected of a samurai enduring hardship.
Instead, the old man casually opened the formidable iron Tessen and began to fan himself, a slow, lazy, oscillating motion that produced a rhythmic, highly irritating thwip, thwip, thwip sound as the thick paper sliced through the stagnant, heavy air. Kenshin's eyes darted away from the infuriating sight, landing instead on the beautifully crafted wooden katana stand positioned in the alcove, where Ishikawa's ancestral swords rested, perfectly polished, flawlessly maintained, and utterly, tragically unused. He stared at the folded steel, imagining the lethal perfection hidden within the lacquered scabbards, and simply could not fathom the mindset of a warrior who would completely ignore his primary weapons in favor of cooling himself with a piece of paper suspended between sticks of iron. The domesticity of the scene was nauseating. Kenshin felt as though he were guarding a delicate courtier, a pampered aristocrat rather than a legendary general who had once commanded legions. The gentle breeze created by the heavy weapon ruffled the wispy white hairs on Ishikawa's chin, a visual detail that only heightened Kenshin's profound disrespect for the man. A true warrior, Kenshin fiercely believed, would sit in the boiling heat without a single complaint, embracing the physical suffering as a necessary tempering of the spirit, rather than relying on a martial tool to provide the soft, decadent comfort of a cooling breeze. Every rhythmic sweep of the fan felt like a personal insult, a mocking dismissal of the hardcore ascetic Bushido code that Kenshin had sacrificed his entire youth to master. Yet another agonizing demonstration of the fan's tragically misplaced utility occurred a few days later, during a highly tense, politically charged council meeting held in the expansive main hall of the castle, an event that pushed Kenshin's contempt toward a dangerous precipice. The room was filled with the abrasive, echoing voices of lesser-clad lords and ambitious vassals, their aggressive tones and sharp, jagged gestures contrasting sharply with the somber, high-contrast monochrome aesthetic of the dark wood paneling and stark white shoji screens. The atmosphere was incredibly volatile, thick with unspoken threats and simmering rivalries, the kind of environment where the subtle shift of a hand toward a hilt could instantly spark a bloodbath. Throughout the escalating cacophony, Ishikawa remained completely silent, his eyes half closed, his face an impenetrable mask of weathered stone, seemingly detached from the vicious political maneuvering swirling around him. Kenshin stood behind him, his hand hovering mere millimeters from his sword, entirely convinced that the old man's silence was a clear symptom of senility, an inability to command the fierce, predatory man in the room. Then, precisely as the argument reached a deafening, chaotic crescendo, Ishikawa moved. He didn't raise his voice, he didn't draw a blade, he simply lifted the closed iron Tessen and brought it down.
The relentless, agonizing buildup of psychological pressure finally reached its absolute boiling point as the weather outside mirrored the turbulent, violent storm raging within Kenshin's chest. A torrential, relentless downpour began, a classic, overwhelming tempest that transformed the sky into a bruised, terrifying expanse of deep grays and aggressive blacks, unleashing a deluge of water that struck the castle with the acoustic fury of 1,000 war drums. Kenshin stood positioned on the exposed edge of the wooden veranda, purposefully choosing the punishing location, allowing the freezing heavy rain to cascade over him, entirely soaking his traditional garments and running in continuous, freezing rivulets down the dark, lacquered plates of his armor. The physical discomfort was extreme, the cold biting deep into his bones, yet he welcomed it, using the harsh, sensory overload of the freezing rain to physically manifest the agonizing mental anguish and festering resentment he had harbored for weeks. He watched the massive volume of water violently cascading off the deeply textured, grooved cedar shingles of the eaves, forming thick, translucent curtains of water that violently shattered upon the slick, mud-splattered stones of the courtyard below. The destructive, unyielding power of the downpour perfectly resonated with his internal state. He felt like a dam that had been subjected to far too much pressure, his rigid discipline and enforced silence rapidly eroding under the constant, unbearable weight of his humiliating assignment. He stared into the gray abyss of the storm, his jaw set so tightly that his teeth ached, his eyes narrowed into furious slits against the driving rain. He had been trained to be a force of nature, a violent hurricane of steel and blood, yet he was relegated to standing still, slowly drowning in the stagnant puddle of a decaying old man's domestic life. The sheer indignity of his situation tasted like bile in his throat, a toxic, corrosive substance that was rapidly eating away at his formidable restraint. As a particularly violent gust of wind rattled the heavy wooden shutters, threatening to tear them from their iron hinges, Kenshin made a hard, irrevocable decision. He could no longer remain a silent, obedient shadow. The warrior's code demanded truth and directness, and he would finally confront the pathetic absurdity of his role, regardless of the consequences, for his spirit was suffocating, and he needed to strike out, to cut through the oppressive fog of irrelevance with the sharp, unforgiving blade of his truth. The ferocious storm eventually broke in the late afternoon, leaving behind a heavy, suffocating, aggressively humid mist that clung to the damp earth and swallowed the lower halves of the fortress walls, transforming the world into a ghostly, high-contrast dreamscape of dark silhouettes and blinding, diffuse white fog. Lord Ishikawa had ventured out into the devastated courtyard, seemingly unfazed by the dampness, lowering his frail frame onto a wet stone bench to quietly admire a gnarled, severely twisted ancient pine tree that had somehow survived the incredible violence of the wind. Kenshin's breaking point had arrived. He stepped off the wooden veranda, his heavy armored boots crushing the wet, displaced gravel with loud, aggressive crunching sounds that deliberately shattered the profound, sacred silence of the misty garden. Every step he took was laden with intense, focused hostility, his body language radiating a barely contained, highly lethal energy. The cinematic, low-angle composition of his approach emphasized his imposing, muscular physique and the cold, deadly glint of his water-stained armor, casting him as a dark, looming predator bearing down upon a completely defenseless, frail prey. The tension in the humid air became incredibly thick, almost viscous, pregnant with the dangerous electricity of impending insubordination. Kenshin stopped a few paces away.
The confrontation exploded into the heavy, misty air as Kenshin finally spoke, his voice tight, clipped, and aggressively laced with a level of disrespect that bordered dangerously on outright treason against his superior. He didn't bother with the traditional, flowery honorifics or the required subservient preamble. His words were launched like a volley of sharp, armor-piercing arrows. He pointed a rigid, accusatory finger directly at the heavy iron Tessen resting casually in Ishikawa's lap. "My lord," Kenshin spat, the title sounding more like a curse. "I must ask, why does a man of your supposed legendary martial stature insist on carrying that courtier's toy?" The deeply offensive words hung in the suffocating mist, a blatant, horrifyingly direct challenge to the elder's authority, wisdom, and warrior spirit. Kenshin leaned forward slightly, his aggressive stance intensifying. "We are surrounded by the drums of war. The air smells of blood and ash. Yet day after day I watch you use a weapon of iron to point at pebbles, to cool your face, to tap on tables like a petulant child demanding attention. Where is your wakizashi? Where is the short sword that houses the true, unyielding soul of the samurai? samurai? Have you completely surrendered your spirit to the comforts of old age, relying on a painted fan while men bleed and die in the mud for your honor?" The torrent of disrespectful questions was a profound breach of every rigid protocol of Bushido, a verbal assault driven by pure, arrogant impatience and a desperate, burning need to understand why he had been shackled to a man who apparently possessed no fight left within him. Kenshin stood his ground, his muscles tensed, fully expecting an explosive reaction, anticipating the old man to finally reveal a spark of his legendary wrath, or perhaps to order Kenshin's immediate execution for such brazen, unthinkable insolence. He welcomed the prospect of punishment if it meant finally breaking the agonizing, peaceful illusion and drawing forth the hidden violence he so desperately craved to see. Ishikawa's reaction, however, completely subverted Kenshin's aggressive expectations, entirely devoid of the sudden movement or fiery anger that the young warrior had mentally prepared to counter. The old man did not flinch, he did not gasp in outraged shock, nor did his hand instinctively move to strike down the insubordinate shadow looming over him. Instead, there was only a profound, unsettling, deeply terrifying stillness, a physical immobility so absolute it seemed to warp the very mist swirling around them. Slowly, with the grinding inevitability of tectonic plates shifting deep beneath the earth, Ishikawa turned his head to look up at Kenshin. A slow, ancient smile began to spread across his weathered, deeply lined face, a smile that entirely failed to reach his dark, glassy eyes, yet radiated an aura of deep, unfathomable, terrifyingly ancient knowledge. The visual contrast was striking. The furious, tightly wound young warrior, composed of sharp angles and cold iron, pitted against the incredibly relaxed, yielding form of the elder, enveloped in the high-contrast monochrome fog that seemed to isolate them from the rest of the world. It was the chilling, absolute stillness of a man who had personally orchestrated the slaughter of thousands, a man who had stared into the very abyss of chaotic violence so many times that the aggressive posturing of a frustrated youth was nothing more than the insignificant buzzing of a solitary gnat. The ambient temperature in the courtyard seemed to plummet precipitously, the damp mist suddenly biting through Kenshin's armor with a bone-deep icy chill that had nothing to do with the weather. Ishikawa's silent, intensely focused gaze bore directly through Kenshin's aggressive facade, effortlessly bypassing the armor and the physical strength, looking deeply into the young man's turbulent, rigidly inflexible soul, quietly observing the chaotic.
Then time itself seemed to violently decelerate, stretching into a slow-motion cinematic sequence as the old man's hand finally moved. Ishikawa's right hand, which up until a moment ago had looked to Kenshin like a collection of fragile, dried parchment stretched tightly over brittle avian bones, reached out and firmly gripped the thick iron base of the Tessen. What happened next occurred with a sudden, impossibly explosive fluidity that completely betrayed the old man's frail appearance, a microscopic glimpse into the terrifying, dormant physical power that still lurked deep within his withered frame. With a highly precise, violently sharp flick of his wrist, entirely invisible in its terrifying speed, Ishikawa snapped the heavy iron fan open. The resulting sound was not a mere rustle of paper, but a loud, incredibly violent percussive crack that echoed through the misty courtyard like a sudden clap of thunder, a sharp metallic detonation that instantly cut through the ambient dripping noises of the wet garden. The intricate, masterfully engineered mechanism of the iron ribs locking into their fully extended, rigid position produced a harsh, unyielding metallic clack, a sound of absolute mechanical finality. Kenshin actually flinched, his highly trained reflexes violently betraying him, as his body instinctively reacted to the sudden, explosive sound as if it were a physical attack.
His hand tightened convulsively on his sword hilt, his eyes wide with momentary shocked adrenaline. In that singular, explosive fraction of a second, the heavy, mundane stick of iron had been violently transformed into a wide, rigid, highly functional shield and striking weapon, demonstrating a flawless, terrifying mastery of the instrument that shattered Kenshin's preconceived notions of the old man's decrepitude. The sheer mechanical precision, the violent speed of the deployment, and the overwhelming sudden auditory assault left Kenshin momentarily breathless, violently snapping his attention away from his arrogant internal monologue and forcing him to focus entirely, with wide, shocked eyes, upon the open surface of the object he had so foolishly and persistently mocked. The camera of Kenshin's intense focus zoomed in entirely upon the taut, highly tensioned painted silk of the fully opened fan, revealing a breathtaking, meticulously detailed piece of artwork that provided a singular, shocking contrast to the dreary world around them. It was a masterpiece of ukiyo-e-style artistry, utilizing a stark, minimalist palette that commanded absolute attention. The vast majority of the delicate surface was dominated by violent, chaotic, dark ink washes, representing a furious, overwhelming storm, with aggressive, slashing brushstrokes depicting howling winds and torrential, punishing rain that seemed to leap off the paper. Yet, standing precisely in the chaotic center of this painted maelstrom was a single, exquisitely rendered white heron. The bird was the only source of brightness, its pristine white feathers a stark, pure defiance against the encroaching darkness. It was depicted standing on only one incredibly thin, fragile-looking leg, completely exposed to the terrifying, violent elements raging around it. At first glance, the delicate creature appeared pathetically weak, a fragile victim entirely at the mercy of the overwhelming natural forces intent on destroying it. But as Kenshin stared deeper into the masterful composition, observing the precise, unyielding angle of the bird's beak pointing directly into the heart of the gale, and the flawless, perfectly balanced alignment of its impossibly thin leg, a profound realization struck him. The heron was not struggling. It was not fighting the storm with brute force or aggressive resistance. It was simply existing within it, accepting the violence, yielding to the wind just enough to avoid being broken, displaying a terrifying passive endurance that made the violently swelling stone.
Lord Ishikawa finally broke the heavy, ringing silence, his voice low, raspy, and deeply textured, grating like two ancient moss-covered millstones slowly grinding together. Yet it carried an immense, crushing weight that felt heavier than a falling mountain. He did not look at Kenshin. His dark, ancient eyes remained serenely fixed upon the violent painted tempest and the stoic white bird. "The strongest tree in the forest," Ishikawa stated, his words cutting cleanly and surgically through the thick, swirling mist, "is never the great, rigid oak that aggressively resists the howling wind with all its immense, unyielding might. When the true typhoon comes, the oak shatters, its hard, inflexible trunk violently broken by its own stubborn refusal to yield." He paused, letting the profound imagery settle heavily over the young warrior. "No, the strongest tree is the supple willow. It bends deeply, almost kissing the earth, yielding completely to the terrible force of the gale. It allows the violence to pass over it, through it, and when the storm finally exhausts itself and dies, the willow simply stands tall once more, entirely unbroken." The immense philosophical weight of the cryptic metaphorical words violently crashed against the heavily armored walls of Kenshin's martial philosophy, a worldview entirely constructed upon the foundational principles of applying brute force, achieving total aggressive dominance, and demonstrating absolute unyielding physical resistance. As the profound lesson hung in the heavy, saturated air, Ishikawa slowly, deliberately closed the fan. There was no explosive speed this time, only a soft, gentle, highly controlled folding of the paper, culminating in a quiet, definitive metallic click as the heavy iron ribs locked perfectly back together, instantly transforming the wide, expressive canvas of profound wisdom back into a singular, harmless-looking dark stick of cold iron. The abrupt, almost magical transition completely bewildered Kenshin, forcefully illustrating the terrifying power of hidden depths and the deceptive nature of outward appearances. The agonizing aftermath of the confrontation left Kenshin entirely adrift in a sea of his own shattered certainties. Lord Ishikawa, requiring no further words and offering no demands for an apology, simply rose from the wet stone bench with his agonizingly slow, shuffling gait and walked quietly away, his frail, dark silhouette slowly dissolving and fading into the dense, encroaching white fog until he vanished completely, returning to his world of profound silence. Kenshin was left standing entirely alone in the devastated, misty courtyard. The torrential rain began to lightly drizzle once more, the cold droplets striking his hot, flushed face. The intense, burning anger and self-righteous resentment that had fueled him for weeks had entirely, completely evaporated, forcefully replaced by a deep, maddening, profoundly irritating sense of confusion and existential doubt. He looked down at the violently twisted, gnarled pine tree that the old man had been admiring, finally noticing how its severe contortions were not a sign of weakness, but a clear physical record of its brilliant, yielding survival against decades of brutal, punishing winds. He slowly looked down at his own hand, still tightly, aggressively gripping the rough hilt of his razor-sharp katana. He had always proudly considered himself to be a man forged of impenetrable iron, a rigid, unstoppable force of martial destruction. Yet, as the cold wind suddenly howled violently around him, harshly rattling the stiff, unyielding lacquered plates of his armor and physically pushing him off balance, he stood there, rigid, entirely unbending, and for the first time in his exceptionally violent life, he felt acutely, terrifyingly fragile. The old man's riddle endlessly echoed in the vast, hollow chamber of his mind, a deeply planted seed of ancient wisdom that Kenshin knew with a single.
Chapter 3. A Lesson in Humility.
The air in the ancient dojo of the Ishikawa family was thick, almost palpable, filled with the smell of old, dried wood, the pungent scent of blade oil, and the acidic sweat of dozens of warriors who had shed blood and tears there for decades. And now the atmosphere seemed to thicken with every passing second, like a dark storm cloud just before a devastating lightning strike. Kenshin knelt in a row with the other students, but his mind was light years away from the meditative calm required of a martial artist, and his interior was like a boiling volcano whose pressure was rising at an exponential rate, fueled by the arrogance, misunderstanding, and youthful hubris that prevented him from accepting Lord Ishikawa's unorthodox teaching methods. Kenshin's every breath was shallow, quick, almost predatory, and his eyes, narrowed into slits, followed with growing contempt and almost physical disgust every, even the smallest, movement of the master, who, with heavenly calm, like a statue carved from the hardest granite, presented delicate, fluid movements using a closed Tessen combat fan, which seemed an absolute mockery to the young warrior, thirsty for blood and brutal strength. From the true path of the sword, the betrayal of the samurai's honor, and the waste of his extraordinary talent, honed over the years, which demanded sharp steel and real danger, not poetic dancing figures with a piece of iron and paper. The monochromatic shadows cast by the afternoon sun, breaking through the tarnished shoji screens, lay in long, sharp stripes on the worn floor, heightening the kinetic tension in the room. And in that split second, Kenshin's mind made the irreversible, fatal decision to brutally end the charade and expose the master's supposed power in front of the entire clan.
The tension that had been choking Kenshin's soul like a slowly tightening noose for weeks finally reached its breaking point, the point of no return, and the frustration, combined with the absolute belief in his own infallible physical and technical superiority, erupted with an eruptive force as the young warrior, breaking all rules of etiquette, strict protocols, and the sacred silence of the dojo, rose from his knees in a movement so violent that his thick cotton robe scraped loudly on the wooden floor, sounding like the crack of a branch breaking in a dead forest. His eyes blazing with a fanatical, arrogant fire, Kenshin stepped forward, his hand gripping the handle of his heavy oak bokken with incredible strength, and his voice, although he tried to sound cold and formal, vibrated with suppressed, animalistic aggression as he formally challenged the champion to a sparring match, falsely declaring that he only wished to delve into and understand the champion's unusual strategy, while his true, the dark goal was to mercilessly expose the weakness of the fan, humiliate the old man, and prove to everyone that the only objective truth in combat is brute force and a sharp blade, and not an ephemeral philosophical fantasy. Kenshin's words hung in the air like a sharp, poisoned arrow that had just left the string, and the entire dojo instantly froze in an absolute, terrifying stillness, reminiscent of a classic ukiyo-e woodcut, where time was brutally stopped, and the remaining students, holding their breath, stared at the young man with a mixture of extreme disbelief, absolute shock, and silent horror, aware of the blasphemy he had just committed in this holy place.
In contrast to the electrifying tension of Kenshin and the paralyzed audience, Lord Ishikawa's reaction was a masterpiece of stoic calm and zen, a phenomenon so unnaturally composed that it sent shivers down your spine as the master, with a face betraying absolutely no emotion, slowly, with almost ritual precision, nodded in acceptance of the challenge, and his eyes, dark and deep as the depths of the ocean, seemed to look not at the arrogant disciple, but straight into his soul, seeing all his fears and pride. With a slowness that was downright physically painful for Kenshin, Ishikawa reached for his priceless ancestral katana, resting at his side like a sleeping dragon, and with the utmost respect, with both hands, he placed it on its special lacquered stand, deliberately depriving himself of his most dangerous tool and clearest symbol of power, which to Kenshin was a powerful, silent insult that screamed louder than any words. Instead of a sword, the master, with a gentle, fluid movement, drew his Tessen, a heavy iron war fan, from his belt, leaving it in a closed form, resembling a short black baton, with only a single faded crimson tassel hanging from it, the only bright accent in the monochromatic, rigorous aesthetic of his attire, and the entire dojo space, preparing for the clash with terrifying, unshakable confidence. Kenshin, determined to end this charade in a split second, assumed a deep, aggressive fighting stance, lowering his center of gravity to an absolute minimum, his thigh muscles tensed like steel cables, and his feet, calloused from years of punishing training on rough stones, dug into the wooden floor with a force that could break the boards, while the oak bokken was raised high above his head in a classic dominant stance, Jodan no Kame-e, ready to deliver one final crushing blow that would split the iron fan in two, and with it the false legend of Lord Ishikawa. The silence in the dojo became deafening, broken only by the whistling of Kenshin's breathing and the microscopic crackling of the wood beneath his feet, and specks of dust, illuminated by the harsh rays of the sun, swirled around his figure like a flock of confused insects, creating around him an aura of inexhaustible, destabilized kinetic energy that demanded immediate release in an act of brutal destruction. With a wild, vibrating roar that shattered the silence of the dojo like a predator tearing into its prey, Kenshin exploded forward, releasing all the energy stored in his body in one murderous attack.
his movements so incredibly fast that to onlookers he became nothing more than a blur of darkness, a swirl of air followed by a heavy oak sword, falling with the speed and force of a guillotine straight onto the unprotected head of the calmly standing master. Kenshin, in his immeasurable arrogance, was in that split second absolutely and undeniably certain that the duel had just ended, that the force of his punch was physically unstoppable by a piece of metal the size of a forearm, and already in his imagination he felt the vibration of defenses breaking, saw the triumph on the faces of his peers, and tasted the sweet nectar of proven superiority, pouring his entire soul, pride and hatred of Tessen's apparent weakness into that one punch. However, what happened in the next millisecond completely and irrevocably shattered the young warrior's perception of reality, for the duel, contrary to his most rational calculations, was unlike anything he had ever encountered in his brutal, violent life on battlefields and in dark alleys. Instead of the expected crack of a defense being breached, Kenshin's ears heard the sharp, bone-vibrating metallic sound of hardwood colliding with solid iron, a sound so powerful that it seemed to resonate within the very structure of the building, and the force of his own.
Ishikawa made no dramatic, sweeping defensive movement. His feet, shod in simple cotton tabi, seemed to slide mere millimeters across the wooden floor, gliding with an inhuman, ephemeral grace, as if he was completely ignoring the basic laws of gravity and physics. And his body became one with the air around him, giving way to the force of the attack, only to change its vector and send it into the void in the same split second. The closed Tessen in the master's hand was no longer just an inanimate object, magically transforming into an organic, living extension of his arm, a vibrating streak of black iron that, with mathematical, almost divine precision, parried, deflected, and smoothly redirected each subsequent, increasingly furious and powerful blow of Kenshin, as if the master had anticipated the student's movements seconds before they were actually born in his brain. Each impact of the oak boken against the solid, cold iron fins of the fan sent a powerful, debilitating shock wave down Kenshin's arms, shaking his bones and tearing his muscles as the young warrior, unable to accept the reality crumbling before his eyes, sank deeper and deeper into an almost animalistic desperation, his mouth twisting into a grimace of pain and pure fury. With each passing second and each subsequent blocked attack, Kenshin's precise technique, learned over years of murderous training, began to irreversibly degrade, falling to pieces under the pressure of growing panic and helplessness, and his blows, once accurate and well thought out, transformed into the wild, chaotic, and uncontrolled aggression of an angry, caged animal that blindly throws itself at the bars, regardless of the pain and bleeding wounds. Sweat began to pour from Kenshin's eyes, stinging and blurring his vision. His breathing became raspy and ragged, and in his mind the arrogant confidence was brutally replaced by black, icy tendrils of fear and disbelief as he realized with terrifying clarity that his unimaginable physical strength and speed were absolutely useless against the perfect, seamless adaptation and incomprehensible understanding of space represented by the silent Lord Ishikawa and his seemingly fragile weapon. In a desperate act of ultimate perdition, feeling his physical and mental strength on the brink of utter exhaustion, Kenshin summoned the last reserves of fury from the depths of his soul and attacked again, putting all his body weight, all his anger, and all his tattered pride into one gargantuan horizontal swing, lunging forward in a final suicidal lunge, believing that the sheer, unbridled brutality would finally break the old man's unnatural defenses.
And in that decisive, fractional moment, when Kenshin found himself at the breaking point of his attack, from which there was absolutely no way to retreat or change the trajectory of the heavy sword, Ishikawa made the move that sealed the fate of the arrogant apprentice. The master made a perfect, minimalist turn on his heel, moving his body out of the line of the blow with the grace of smoke flying on the wind, allowing Kenshin's destructive energy to pull him towards the inevitable doom. The Tessen in Ishikawa's hand, previously acting as an impenetrable shield, suddenly changed its nature, darting through the air like a striking cobra with deadly speed and precision, its cold, diamond-hard iron ribs precisely encircling and trapping Kenshin's sword-wielding hand, pinning it to his own wrist with the shocking mechanical ruthlessness of a lever, blocking every slight movement. In a split second, Ishikawa applied crushing, agonizing pressure to the trapped wrist, targeting the neural plexus with surgical precision, which immediately sent a paralyzing wave of incandescent pain down Kenshin's entire arm, instantly cutting off all signals from his brain to his hand, and causing his clenched fingers to immediately, involuntarily loosen all power and ability to hold the weapon. The oak bokken, deprived of its motive force, slipped from Kenshin's limp hand and fell to the worn wooden floor with a dull, unpleasant clatter, the sound echoing eerily off the austere walls of the martial arts temple, resonating in the young warrior's mind like a mighty bell announcing the final, unconditional end of his arrogant world. Off balance, paralyzed with pain and overwhelmed by the unimaginable weight of his defeat, Kenshin fell limply to his knees, hitting the wooden planks with a loud thud. Defeated, completely and absolutely disarmed, humiliated before the entire clan, not by the legendary sword forged by a master blacksmith, not by overwhelming physical strength, but by a simple, inconspicuous fan in the hand of a man he had just moments ago considered a pitiable old man. There was a silence in the dojo so deep and absolute that it resembled the vacuum of space. No one present even dared to take a deep breath so as not to defile the seriousness of this moment. And in the air thick with dust, the only sounds could be heard the uneven, whistling breath of the defeated warrior and the gentle rustle of Lord Ishikawa's silk robes, who returned to his original, perfectly balanced and calm posture. Kenshin knelt motionless, with his eyes unconsciously fixed on his own empty, convulsively shaking hands, from which all pride and imaginary power had fled, while his powerful, once indestructible ego was trampled and shattered into millions of sharp, bleeding shards in just a dozen or so seconds, brutally verifying his false sense of worth and forcing him to confront his own painful incompetence. For the first time in his life of anger and violence, Kenshin slowly and with great difficulty raised his eyes to look at the Tessen resting in his master's hand, not with the dark contempt of an ignorant man, but with a newborn, almost overwhelming and terrifyingly deep respect. Finally understanding that true, absolute strength in the martial arts resides not in a piece of sharpened steel, but in an unwavering peace of mind, flexibility, humility, and a perfect understanding of the harmony of the universe. And this mere piece of iron and silk had just opened the gate to the true path of a warrior.
Chapter 4. Whispers on a Map.
Kenshin remained in absolute stillness, kneeling on the rough, uneven tatami mats, the interwoven fibers of which cut into his aching knees, reminding him with each passing second of the crushing physical and spiritual defeat he had just experienced at the hands of his old master. And his mind, once full of arrogant self-confidence and loud, youthful pride, now resembled a battle-ravaged field shrouded in a thick, impenetrable fog. A humility in which every ancient truth about the art of the sword seemed only a fragile illusion torn to shreds by one precise blow of an iron fan.
Kenshin's aching muscles still trembled with the echoes of that clash, and the bruises on his body throbbed with a dull ache that became a harsh new teacher for him, making him brutally aware that the strength of his muscles and the speed of his blade were nothing compared to the cool, calculating calm of a mind free from ego and anger. The world around him lost its bright colors, fading to stark monochromatic shades of gray and black, as if his own perception had become attuned to the ascetic, dreary lifestyle of Ishikawa himself. And the only sound that reached his ears through the veil of inner dullness was the monotonous, unrelenting sound of heavy rain pounding furiously against the wooden roofs of the fortress. This rain was like an endless lament from the sky, washing away the blood and sweat from the courtyard, but unable to wash away the deep sense of shame that burned the young warrior's soul, forcing him to completely redefine his understanding of the honor of fighting and the very nature of weapons. Kenshin looked down at his hands resting heavily on his thighs, hands calloused from years of murderous training with a katana, hands that had killed many enemies and which now seemed useless and clumsy to him, like a child taking his first steps in a world full of hidden deadly mechanisms that he himself could not yet see or understand. In this heavy, silent atmosphere, Kenshin realized that his real training had only just begun, and the sword he carried at his side suddenly seemed like an unwieldy piece of dead steel compared to the endless possibilities that lay within the quiet, agile, and inconspicuous form of the fan. Suddenly, the heavy, shrill beat of war drums interrupted his gloomy thoughts, summoning all commanders and senior officers of the clan to a sudden emergency war council, which immediately awoke Kenshin from his lethargy and forced him to get up from the mat, although every movement caused him pain and his mind was still heavy with recent discoveries. He walked through the long, dark corridors of the castle, which were filled with darkness, dissipated only by the faint flickering light cast by sparsely placed iron braziers, and the air was filled with the suffocating smell of wet wood, burning coal, and tension so thick that you could almost feel its metallic taste on your tongue. The rain outside had intensified, and the wind howled furiously between the wooden pillars, as if the elements themselves were announcing the coming of the final catastrophe that would consume their entire line. And with each step Kenshin took, the feeling of impending doom intensified. When he finally reached the huge oak door of the meeting room, he felt his heart begin to beat faster to the rhythm of war drums, and after crossing the threshold, he was hit by a wave of hot, stale air saturated with the smell of sweat and fear, and his eyes were met with a sight that resembled a scene from the darkest nightmares of the past. In a huge hall with a high vault, supported by massive raw beams, all the most important clan strategists, dressed in their heavy lacquered armor, shining in the twilight, the cold shine of which contrasted with the delicate white of the paper shoji screens, and the only accent of color in this gloomy gathering were the blood-red clan pennants hanging sadly from the ceiling like grim harbingers of the coming slaughter. In the
middle of this deafening chaos, amidst the swirling insults and the pounding of fists on the table, Kenshin spotted a figure that in no way fit the madness around him, and that was none other than Old Master Ishikawa. Ishikawa was sitting cross-legged on a small mat some distance from the main meeting table, and his figure was the embodiment of absolute impeccable calm that seemed almost unnatural compared to the fury and panic of the other commanders. He wore a simple, unadorned dark kimono made of rough material that absorbed the faint light of the torches, making the old master look like a shadow separated from the rest of the world by an invisible barrier of concentration. His face, as sharp and dry as parchment, expressed absolutely no emotions, and his half-closed eyes did not look at the arguing men, but seemed to penetrate the thick texture of the map, through the walls of the castle and through space itself, capturing the essence of the problem in a way inaccessible to ordinary mortals. Kenshin stared at Ishikawa with a fascination bordering on awe, realizing that this silent attitude was not a sign of ignorance or indifference, but on the contrary, it was a state of extreme alert and concentration, a state in which the master's mind processes thousands of variables, analyzes every possible scenario, and searches for the single point where the application of minimal force will bring maximum destructive effect. At that moment, a loud, sharp sound pierced the air, forcing everyone to suddenly fall silent, and it was the sound of an iron-shod staff hitting the wooden floor made by the clan lord himself, who until then had been sitting silently on his dais, his face hidden in the shadows cast by his ornate helmet. The ruler was an old, sick man whose shoulders were bent under the unimaginable burden of responsibility for the fate of his people, and his eyes looked at the gathered commanders with sadness and growing frustration. When the screams finally stopped and the room was filled with a thick, ringing silence, interrupted only by the crackle of burning wood in the braziers and the sound of rain outside the window, the clan lord slowly moved his gaze around the gathered people until his gaze finally stopped on the motionless figure of Ishikawa. Taking a deep breath, the ruler uttered only a few words, but their weight and meaning made the temperature in the room seem to drop by a few degrees. And the words read, "I await your advice, old friend." All eyes in the room immediately turned to Ishikawa, and many of the commanders had expressions of disbelief and contempt, as they couldn't understand why their ruler, in the face of such a critical military threat, would seek help from a man who wears no armor, commands no troops, and whose only visible weapon is a simple folding fan tucked into his belt. Kenshin held his breath with all his strength, clenching his hands into fists in anticipation of what was to come, and his heart was pounding like crazy, hitting his ribs with such force that he was afraid others would hear it. Ishikawa did not respond to his master's call, did not nod his head, did not make any sound that might betray his thoughts, but slowly, with extraordinary fluidity and precision that completely masked his advanced age, he rose from the mat and stood erect in the dim light of the room. His movements were so economical and well thought out that it seemed that the old master was not resisting gravity at all, but rather moving along invisible lines of force connecting him with the earth. With each step he took towards the table with the map, the silence in the room became heavier and more palpable, and the aggressive commanders subconsciously took half a step back, making way for him, as if they sensed the aura of danger surrounding this seemingly defenseless old man. When Ishikawa finally stood over the huge map, the light for nearby
Chapter 7. Teatr negocjacji.
The landscape was like a canvas forgotten by the gods, drowned in a monochromatic gray, broken only by rare, faded traces of its former glory. The no-man's land, stretching between the two powerful armies of the Oda and Sato clans, was covered in thick, sticky fog. It crawled over the hoof-worn and blood-soaked soil like a living, sinister organism, devouring all contours and shapes. In the heart of this eerie wasteland stood an old tea-house, the only surviving building for miles around, whose rotting wooden walls had miraculously survived the earlier brutal skirmishes. The air was extremely heavy here, saturated with the smell of wet wood, damp earth, omnipresent rust, and the inevitable death that hung over the fields like an invisible shroud. Kenshin, standing in the deep shadow of the ruined entrance, observed the gloomy, gray-shrouded theater through the narrow slits in his iron helmet. The low, leaden clouds seemed to press down on the ground with unnatural force, almost touching the jagged clay roofs of the tea-house.
In this visual masterpiece of austerity, where black and white dominated all senses, the only color accent was the flag of an unknown soldier abandoned in the mud, its faded, dirty scarlet reminding of the blood spilled here just a few days earlier. The silence was deafening, even painful to the ears, broken only by the occasional dull thud of heavy raindrops on the dry, cracked bamboo gutters. Every sound, even the smallest one, echoed throughout the wasteland, adding to the tension that grew thicker with each passing second. In this desert, suspended in time and space, between life and death, between fragile peace and total annihilation, the final act of desperate diplomacy was to take place. Kenshin felt cold, icy sweat trickling slowly down his neck beneath the heavy armor plates. He was perfectly aware that this terrifying silence was just an illusion, a prelude to the storm that was to come with the approaching steps of a powerful enemy. The fog swirled wildly around the wooden pillars of the porch, creating ghostly, phantasmal shapes that seemed to mercilessly mock humanity's fragile attempts to bring order to a world engulfed in the chaos of war and endless slaughter. Suddenly, from the white, impenetrable wall of fog, a rhythmic, disturbing, and extremely heavy sound emerged. It was the dull thud of dozens of armored boots hitting the muddy ground steadily. A delegation from the enemy Oda clan was approaching with the inevitability of the sea tide, led by General Honda, a powerful, fearsome warrior with the stature of a bear and a dark reputation as a ruthless butcher of the eastern provinces. His figure grew larger with each step until it emerged from the fog shroud in all its brutal, monumental glory. Honda was the living embodiment of arrogance and uninhibited violence. His strut was extremely wide and audacious, his massive black lacquered armor creaking ominously and loudly with every slight movement. Above his steel-clad head fluttered the monumental banner of the Oda clan, its deep, saturated color of dried blood providing a brutal, desaturated contrast to the overwhelming, stuffy grayness of the surroundings. It was the only living element in this completely lifeless landscape, pulsating with an unspoken threat and an unbridled aggression that seemed to burn the oxygen from the air. The general's face, brutally scarred with old, jagged scars from countless battles, was contorted in a permanent grimace of contempt, and his dark eyes burned with wild, almost animal fanaticism. Honda did not come here with the intention of negotiating peace terms. He came here solely to ruthlessly dictate his own rules, to humiliate a weaker opponent and ultimately crush his will to fight even before issuing the first formal order to attack. His powerful, horny...
Chapter 8. The Hidden Spine of Iron. War was now inevitable, and its heavy, suffocating breath hung over the entire province like the thick, impenetrable fog that enveloped the clan estate that evening. There was an almost palpable tension in the air, electrifying every speck of moisture, every falling leaf, and every shadow cast by the old, twisted pines. Kenshin followed closely behind his master, Ishikawa, and their footsteps were muffled by the rain-soaked ground, resembling a dark, bottomless quagmire. The path led away from the main buildings, towards a private forge hidden deep in the forest, a place that for many household members remained only a dark legend. The night sky was covered with leaden clouds, through which not even the slightest ray of moon could shine through, and the only source of light was the restless red glow emanating from a distant building. Kenshin felt a mixture of deep anticipation and cold, overwhelming fear growing within him with each step. He knew that today's lesson would be different from all the previous ones. There was no time left for repeating forms, for meditating on the beauty of a falling cherry blossom, or for subtle reflections on the harmony of the spirit. The time of blood, iron, and brutal truth was coming, which would finally strip his world of its last illusions. The wind howled softly between the branches, sounding like a mournful song for the times of peace that were now fading into the irrevocable past. The young samurai adjusted his grip on the hilt of his sword, although he knew that it would not be the katana that would be the center of attention tonight. The atmosphere was thick with smoke and the smell of approaching death, and the contrast between the quiet, seemingly calm nature and the storm raging in Kenshin's heart was reminiscent of scenes from the darkest stories of honor and betrayal. Every element of the surroundings, from the rough bark of the trees to the cold, sharp wind, intensified the feeling of the approaching end of an era. Ishikawa didn't say a word. His silhouette was just a black outline against the bloody glow of the forge, and his silence weighed more than 1,000 loud warnings. They entered the very center of the element, the place where destruction was born. The interior of the forge greeted them with a burst of heat that almost took Kenshin's breath away. It was an austere place, devoid of any decorations, a temple dedicated exclusively to one deity, the merciless power of fire and iron. In the twilight, illuminated only by irregular, spasmodic flashes of hot coals, everything seemed sharper, more expressive, framed by dramatic chiaroscuro. The smell was intoxicating, the sharp metallic scent of hot iron mingling with the acrid smoke of charcoal and the subtle hint of the sweat of generations of craftsmen who had forged death here. There were tools lying around, shaped so crude and brutal that they were terrifying in themselves. Heavy hammers with scarred heads, pincers resembling demons' mouths, piles of shapeless metal waiting to be awakened. In the center of this dark sanctuary stood a great furnace, whose open gates resembled an entrance to the depths of hell. Ishikawa turned towards Kenshin, and the flickering light of the fireplace carved deep furrows into his old, worn face, making him look like the merciless war deity from ancient ukiyo-e woodblock prints. Kenshin felt a bead of cold sweat trickle down his back, contrasting with the overwhelming heat radiating from the fireplace. The master's eyes were dark, unreadable, devoid of any trace of the former gentleness or indulgence. In his hands, he held an object that seemed painfully out of place in this stark, almost industrial setting, an elegant, intricately decorated Tessen war fan. The folded fan, with its smooth lacquer that gleamed in the dark and a silk cord on which a single red faded tassel swayed with age, looked like a relic of a bygone, refined era of court intrigues and poetic ecstasy. However, in the long
Chapter 9. The Iron Fortress.
The dawn arrived not with the gentle warmth of the rising sun, but with a creeping, suffocating pall of ash-gray fog that swallowed the distant mountains and transformed the ancestral training courtyard into an isolated, monochromatic purgatory. The air was heavy, thick with the smell of damp earth, decaying pine needles, and the sharp metallic tang of an impending storm. Kenshin stood motionless in the center of the raked gravel, his bare feet encased in thin cotton tabi socks that offered no protection against the biting, pervasive chill of the morning earth. In his right hand, the Tessen, the iron war fan, felt heavier than it ever had before, a cold, unyielding, dead weight that seemed entirely inadequate for the trial that awaited him. The rough grain of the wooden dojo veranda behind him and the smooth, cold iron of the fan's outer ribs were the only anchors tethering his racing mind to reality. This was not the familiar rhythmic dance of wooden bokken clashing in the afternoon sun. This was the crucible, the ultimate test of the iron fortress. The atmospheric pressure seemed to crush against his chest, making every breath a conscious, labored effort. The visual world was stripped of its comforting hues, rendered in stark, brutal shades of black, white, and endless gray, exactly like the classic dramatic compositions of the old ukiyo-e masters that hung in the clan's inner sanctums.
He could see every individual grain of mist drifting lazily across his field of vision, the fog acting as a blank canvas upon which his deepest, most primal terrors were beginning to project themselves. His training was about to enter its most dangerous, unforgiving phase, a phase where a single mistake, a fraction of a second's hesitation, or a millimeter of miscalculation would result not in a bruise or a reprimand, but in the permanent final severing of flesh and bone. He was to use the Tessen, a weapon ostensibly of elegance and courtly grace, defensively against a live, meticulously sharpened steel blade. The sheer absurdity of the proposition gnawed at the edges of his sanity, threatening to unravel the months of grueling, repetitive conditioning he endured under Ishikawa's merciless gaze. Yet as he stared into the swirling abyss of the morning mist, feeling the cold bite of the iron fan against his calloused palm, he understood that there was no retreat, no alternative path, and no mercy to be found in the gray void before him. Out of the dense, swirling mist emerged the imposing silhouette of his sparring partner, a towering figure that seemed less like a man and more like an elemental force of destruction manifested from the ether. This was Master Katsumoto, one of the clan's most revered and feared swordsmen, a veteran of countless skirmishes, whose very presence commanded absolute, terrifying silence. The heavy rhythmic crunch of Katsumoto's straw sandals on the raked gravel sounded like the ticking of a doomsday clock, each step vibrating up through the earth and into Kenshin's tense muscles. The master was fully arrayed in traditional, deeply lacquered combat armor. The intricate silk lacing that bound the armor together was dark, blending into the shadowy, high-contrast aesthetic of the courtyard, save for a single vivid splash of color that aggressively pierced the monochrome tableau, a brilliant blood-red crimson sageo cord tied with meticulous precision around the scabbard of his katana. This solitary thread of color acted as a mesmerizing, fatal focal point, drawing Kenshin's terrified gaze directly to the weapon that was meant to strike him down. Slowly, with a deliberate theatrical menace that echoed the dramatic pacing of a no play, Katsumoto drew his blade. The sound was a long, agonizing hiss of folded steel sliding against polished wood, a pure, deadly note that seemed to slice through the heavy fog and reverberate.
Chapter 10. A Master's Memory.
The night hung over the encampment like a suffocating shroud of damp, heavy wool, a physical weight that pressed down upon the shoulders of every man who dared to draw breath in the freezing mountain air. High above the jagged, unforgiving peaks of the surrounding valley, a pale, anemic moon struggled to pierce the thick, swirling banks of fog that rolled across the terrain like a spectral tide, casting long, distorted shadows that danced with malicious intent against the taut fabric of the command tents. Inside his isolated pavilion, bathed in the high-contrast, monochromatic glare of the filtered moonlight, Kenshin sat perfectly cross-legged on a simple woven mat, his posture rigidly dictated by years of martial discipline, yet betrayed by the microscopic, uncontrollable tremors racking his exhausted body. Across his lap rested his drawn katana, a masterpiece of folded steel that gleamed with a cold, predatory silver light, its razor-sharp edge seemingly hungry for the bloodshed that the impending dawn promised to bring. He was engaged in the meditative ritual of polishing the blade, applying a fine dusting of uchiko powder and wiping it away with a delicate silk cloth, but the rhythmic motion brought him absolutely no solace, no reprieve from the chaotic storm of anxiety raging within his mind. The scent of pungent clove oil, sharp and medicinal, mixed with the metallic tang of polished iron and the damp, earthy aroma of the encroaching fog, creating a sensory cocktail that nauseated him with its visceral reminder of mortality. Every scrape of the silk against the steel resonated in the quiet tent like a death knell, echoing the erratic staccato beating of his own terrified heart.
He was a man drowning in the shallow waters of his own anticipation, hyper-aware of every sound outside the canvas walls, the muffled, uneasy snorting of the tethered war horses, the rhythmic clinking of lamellar armor as sentries paced their dreary rounds, the low, murmuring groans of thousands of sleeping soldiers who were completely oblivious to the paralyzing terror gripping their young commander. The monochrome aesthetic of the night, drained of all color save for the harsh blacks, glaring whites, and endless shades of gray, perfectly mirrored the bleakness of his internal landscape, a desolate battlefield of the mind, where his courage was continuously routed by the phantom armies of his own self-doubt and fear of the catastrophic failure that tomorrow might bring. This paralyzing dread was not rooted in the simple primal fear of his own physical demise, for every samurai was intimately acquainted with the impermanence of life and had made peace with the blade long before stepping onto the battlefield. Rather, Kenshin's torment stemmed from the crushing monolithic burden of leadership, the terrifying realization that his decisions, his signals, his split-second judgments would directly dictate the survival or slaughter of the thousands of men currently resting in the mud outside his tent. He stared into the polished mirror of his katana, but instead of his own reflection, he saw the horrific, chaotic visions of the morrow, broken lines, screaming men, the earth churning with blood and severed limbs, all occurring because his hand faltered, because his strategic mind proved inadequate for the brutal calculus of war. The war fan, the traditional gunbai that lay resting on a lacquered stand beside him, felt less like a tool of command and more like an impossibly heavy anchor threatening to drag him into the abyss of historical disgrace. He possessed the theoretical knowledge of the fan, the countless hours of drilling, the memorization of formations and signals, but standing on the precipice of actual carnage, that knowledge felt agonizingly fragile, as thin and easily torn as the delicate papers spanning the iron ribs of the fan itself. The wind outside began to howl with renewed ferocity, ripping through the guy ropes of the tent and sound.
Chapter 11. The First Clash.
The morning dawn brought with it neither warmth nor sun, but only a thick, impenetrable fog that enveloped the entire plain like a ghastly, damp shroud, muffling all sounds and blurring the contours of the world around them. The air was heavy, almost tangible, filled with the smell of wet earth, rotting leaves, and cold iron that cooled the skin even through thick layers of clothing. Kenshin stood in the front row of the advance guard, his heart pounding against his ribs with such force that it felt like his entire armor was vibrating. This wasn't the excitement he had imagined during his long years of training in the dojo courtyard. It was pure, paralyzing fear, a dull dread of the unknown that tightened in his throat and made his breathing shallow and ragged. Drops of dew settled on the black lacquered plates of his armor, flowing down the intricately woven silk ropes like icy tears, intensifying the feeling of intense cold. In this overwhelming milky white, where visibility was limited to only a few steps, every rustle, every creak of skin or muffled cough of a comrade in arms standing next to him became a harbinger of approaching death. Kenshin closed his frozen fingers around the rough braid of his katana's hilt, feeling the hard texture of the raised skin under his fingertips, and tried to remember his master's teachings about the emptiness of the mind. But in the face of this overwhelming unknown, his mind was more like a stormy sea than a calm lake. As time inexorably passed, the fog began to slowly, even lazily, rise upwards, torn by gentle gusts of morning wind, and the first ghostly shapes began to emerge from the milky void. What initially looked like the faint shadows of leafless trees quickly took the form of a terrifying, brutal reality that took Kenshin's breath away. The entire horizon, as far as the eye could see, was bristling with thousands of yari spears, their steel tips catching the first pale rays of sunlight, shining with a cold, murderous light.
This was the army of the Oda clan, an endless sea of warriors armed with black armor, the mass of which seemed endless. In this monochromatic world of grey, black, and dirty white, the only shocking colour accent were the high-raised Norbori banners, fluttering in the wind like splashes of fresh, vibrant blood, bearing the gold and black mons of the enemy clan. The scale of it was so unimaginable, so overwhelming, that Kenshin felt his knees go weak, and all his youthful notions of glorious, poetic one-on-one combat crumbled to dust in the face of this mechanical, soulless war machine. The terrifying silence that had dominated the battlefield was suddenly brutally shattered by a sound so powerful and inhuman that it seemed to vibrate in the very bones of the tense warriors. It was not a single scream, but a monstrous, multi-voiced roar of thousands of throats united in a primal lust for murder that rolled across the plain like a clap of thunder. This eerie chorus was joined by the deep, piercing sounds of Horagai shell horns and the rhythmic pounding beats of powerful taiko drums that made the ground literally tremble beneath their feet. The illusion of morning calm was gone forever, and in its place was absolute terror, a physical, tangible terror that turned the blood in Kenshin's veins to ice. He saw the vast mass of people moving forward, slowly at first like a creeping shadow, then faster and faster, gaining devastating momentum with each step, like an avalanche of black steel and screaming faces from which there was no escape or rescue. The collision of the two armies resembled the collision of two powerful ocean waves crashing on the rocky coast during the most terrible storm. The earth shook.
Chapter 12. A Duel of Wits. The battle blizzard swirling in the darkness consumed everything Kenshin had previously considered the known world, turning the battlefield into a chaotic, monochromatic nightmare, reminiscent of the darkest visions of classic ukiyo-e woodcuts, in which human life mattered less than an autumn leaf falling in the wind. A thick, throat-choking fog, mixed with smoke from peasants' huts burning in the distance and the pungent smell of gunpowder from primitive arquebuses, enveloped the battlefield in a choking shroud through which only the ghostly, muffled screams of dying warriors and the terrible metallic clang of swords mercilessly striking each other could occasionally be heard. Kenshin, disoriented by the sudden and brutal disruption of his own unit during a surprise enemy charge, suddenly found himself in absolute terrifying isolation, cut off from his comrades in arms by a wall of enemy bodies and a thickening haze that seemed to absorb every sound and every ray of the already faint, dim sun hidden behind heavy leaden clouds. Around him, as in a ghostly theater of shadows, blurred silhouettes of combatants flitted by, and the only accents of color in this gray world, devoid of all hope, were bright crimson splashes of blood falling on black, lacquered armor, and rare, tattered clan banners flapping in the wind like the broken wings of defeated demons. The rain began to fall with unexpected fury, and its heavy, icy drops hit the helmets and shoulder pads with a dull, rhythmic thud, turning the packed earth under the combatants' feet into a muddy, slippery swamp of bloody mud, in which each step required superhuman effort and flawless maintaining of body balance. In this thick, dark atmosphere, permeated with almost physically tangible fear and the sweetish smell of death, Kenshin felt his heart beating against his chest with the steady force of a blacksmith's hammer, and all his senses sharpened to the limits of human capabilities, registering every, even the smallest, movement and swirl of air in the thick fog. He was completely alone, dependent only on his own instincts, and his only support in this chaotic, merciless world was the icy cold of bare steel in his right hand, and hidden in his left, the seemingly harmless iron Tessen war fan, which now seemed to be the only tangible link to the wisdom and teachings of his former master.
With each breath, he inhaled the icy, humid air deep into his lungs, desperately trying to calm the racing thoughts in his mind and find within himself the same state of absolute, undisturbed Zen peace that Master Ishikawa spoke about so often and with such passion in the comfort of their mountain dojo, far from the soul-destroying atrocities of the bloody clan war. From this impenetrable, swirling curtain of thick fog and diagonal, face-whipping streams of icy rain suddenly emerged the terrifying silhouette of an enemy warrior, a mighty samurai bearing on his armor the proud and hated insignia of the Oda clan, who, like a vengeful demon from the oldest, forgotten Japanese legends, strode across the ruined battlefield, obviously looking for another victim for his merciless, bloody harvest. His armor, made of hundreds of intricately connected silk-corded iron plates, lacquered a deep, shiny black, gleamed in the muted gray light like the armor of a gigantic dark insect, and each drop of rain that crackled off it seemed to only emphasize the dark, almost inhuman tower and massiveness of this sinister figure. On his head he wore a heavy, intricately wrought kabuto helmet, adorned with a grim brass horn-shaped crest gem, which was heavily scratched and deeply dented from dozens of previous murderous encounters, a clear testament to his vast, battle-hardened experience and extremely brutal effectiveness in direct hand-to-hand combat at sword range.
Chapter 13. The Commander's Dance.
The air in the valley had ceased to be something one could simply breathe. It had transformed into a thick, suffocating slurry of atomized blood, pulverized earth, and the bitter, sulphurous tang of black powder smoke drifting from the distant matchlock lions. The Sato clan's center formation, once a proud and unyielding wall of interlocking wooden shields and bristling yari spears, was now experiencing the terrifying, agonizing physics of a catastrophic structural collapse. The Oda forces did not simply attack, they surged forward like a localized natural disaster, a relentless, churning tidal wave of jagged iron, lacquered leather, and screaming humanity that crashed against the Sato defenders with bone-shattering kinetic force. Kenshin, having miraculously managed to rejoin his designated vanguard unit after the chaotic initial skirmishes, found himself trapped in the absolute epicenter of this meat grinder. His physical senses were entirely overwhelmed, bombarded by a cacophony so loud it transcended mere sound and became a physical pressure against his skull. The metallic shrieks of katana blades biting into hardened armor plates, the sickening wet thuds of blunt force trauma crushing human ribs, and the desperate, animalistic wails of men dying in the freezing mud blended into a single continuous roar of pure, unfiltered nightmare. The visual world was reduced to a claustrophobic, high-contrast monochrome of churning grey mud and darkened steel, punctuated only by horrifying, desaturated splashes of crimson arterial spray and the terrifyingly bright, bloody lacquer of the advancing Oda infantry armor. Every breath Kenshin took was a ragged, desperate gasp, burning his throat as he pushed with every ounce of his remaining physical strength against the back of the Ashigaru in front of him, trying in vain to halt the terrifying backward momentum. But the ground beneath their straw-sandaled feet was no longer solid earth. It was a treacherous, slippery paste of rainwater and gore, offering no purchase, no anchor against the overwhelming pressure of the enemy mass. Panic, cold and absolute, began to slither through the Sato ranks like a venomous serpent, paralyzing limbs and shattering discipline, as the terrifying realization dawned upon the exhausted men that their center line, the very heart of their defensive strategy, was buckling, fracturing, and mere moments away from a complete and utterly fatal disintegration.
The anatomy of this impending collapse was laid bare before Kenshin's horrified eyes in a sequence of excruciatingly slow, agonizing micro-moments. He watched the man directly to his left, a seasoned veteran with a scarred cheek, suddenly lose his footing in the slick entrails of a fallen horse, his long spear slipping from rain-slicked fingers as a rusted Oda halberd cleaved through the flimsy iron plating of his shoulder guard. The veteran's scream was instantly swallowed by the roar of the crowd, his body immediately trampled under the ruthless advance of the crimson-armored tide. This single death created a microscopic vacuum in the defensive line, a tiny tear in the fabric of their formation, which the Oda forces exploited with terrifying, predatory efficiency. The red wave pushed harder, the pressure multiplying exponentially as the Sato front rank was forced to take a collective, involuntary step backward, their straw sandals sliding through the bloody mire. That single step backward was a psychological death knell. It was the physical manifestation of yielding, the undeniable proof that they were losing ground, losing strength, losing the battle. Kenshin could feel the tremor of terror vibrating through the bodies of the men pressed against him, a contagious, electric current of despair that sapped the strength from their muscles and the resolve from their hearts. The high-contrast nightmare of the battlefield seemed to close in on him, the shadows deepening into abyssal blackness, while the
Chapter 14. The Canyon's Embrace.
The fog hung in the gorge like thick, breathing smoke, covering the canyon floor in a pale, ghostly shroud that seemed to absorb all sounds of the march. Kenshin's squad moved forward with mechanical, relentless precision, guided by their trust in the signals they received from Ishikawa's scouts. Each step echoed against the damp, black rocks that rose on either side like the walls of a gigantic, ancient tomb, trapping them in the stark stone cage. The air was heavy, filled with the smell of wet earth, rotting leaves, and cold iron. The samurai, lulled by a series of recent successes, marched with their heads held high, their armor gleaming dully in the rare flashes of gray light that struggled to penetrate the leavened clouds. Kenshin led the way, his hand resting firmly on the hilt of his katana, the weapon that was an extension of his soul and will. The monochromatic landscape around them, in stark shades of gray, black, and faded white, intensified their sense of isolation, but at the same time gave them an illusion of control over the space. The soldiers believed that they were predators closing a trap on the retreating forces of the Oda family, that the narrow path they followed was the path to final triumph, and not the throat of the beast that was about to clamp down on them. An unwavering confidence burned in their hearts, fueled by adrenaline and a belief in the infallibility of their command, ignoring the subtle warning signs that nature itself was sending, the sudden silence of the birds, the unnatural stillness of the wind in the trees on the cliff tops, and the growing feeling of claustrophobia that was beginning to choke the gorge. This march, full of pride and military arrogance, was the perfect prelude to the chaos to come, an illusion of security woven from false assumptions and blind obedience to orders that in reality were leading them straight into the brutal slaughter that would spell the end of their illusions. With each meter passed, the canyon tightened its stone arms, and the space around the marching unit shrank with inexorable, almost geometric precision. The walls of the gorge, made of jagged basalt rock, seemed to bend over the warriors, creating an asymmetric tunnel that barely accommodated 3 men walking shoulder to shoulder. The wet, slimy stones from the constant drizzle gleamed like the scales of a giant black snake, reflecting the distorted silhouettes of samurai in the bleak, merciless light.
In this harsh, claustrophobic environment, every sound took on an unnatural power. The clang of pieces of armor hitting each other, the soft crunch of gravel under straw sandals, and even the heavy, collective breathing of tired men sounded like the warning growl of an approaching storm. The sky above them narrowed to a narrow gray gap from which sporadically lonely withered leaves fell like tears shed by the dying forest on the cliff tops. Kenshin, despite his innate self-confidence, began to feel a subcutaneous anxiety, a cold shiver running down his spine, a survival instinct whispering in his ear that this geography was a dead-end trap in which the traditional sword arts might prove completely useless. He felt the space in which he had spent a lifetime learning to maneuver the long curved blade of the katana disappear, replaced by vertical barriers of unyielding granite that had no room for wide cuts or smooth dodges. The image of the reality surrounding them was reminiscent of a classic ukiyo-e woodcut, in which the brutal, almost geometric texture of the rocks contrasted with the fragile, transient nature of human life trapped at the bottom of this stone tomb, where each step brought them closer to the point of no return, entering an area of absolute danger and imprisonment in a rock trap. Suddenly, in a single heartbeat, the ominous silence of the gorge was shattered by the cacophony of primal, unimaginable chaos.
Chapter 15. The Final Confrontation.
The Oda forces were shattered, their once proud formations completely dissolved into a chaotic, desperate retreat across the treacherous, endlessly rain-soaked plains of Ashigahara. The sky wept cold, relentless tears, turning the ancient earth into a deep, sucking mire of black and gray sludge, a monochromatic nightmare ripped straight from the darkest, most despairing ukiyo-e woodblocks depicting the hell of war. Only the scattered, broken battle standards of the Oda clan provided a stark, violent splash of desaturated crimson against the suffocating bleakness of the howling storm. The fierce wind screamed through the skeletal remains of the valley's ancient pines, carrying with it the frantic, animalistic cries of fleeing Ashigaru infantrymen and the sickening squelch of thousands of soaked straw sandals desperately fighting the unforgiving mud. Freezing water pooled deeply in the jagged craters left by earlier artillery fire, reflecting the pale, leaden sky like the unblinking, sightless eyes of the freshly dead. Amidst this grand, catastrophic collapse, the Sato forces pressed their hard-won advantage, a tidal wave of righteous vengeance sweeping forward, their lamellar armor slick with rain and gore. Yet the pursuit was not absolute, nor was the victory yet secured. At the crucial choke point of the valley's throat, exactly where the jagged, unforgiving cliffs squeezed the path into a dangerously narrow corridor of sharp stone, the panicked retreat abruptly halted. The vanguard of the Sato pursuit crashed violently against an immovable, terrifying object, a desperate rearguard action that completely defied the surrounding panic and chaos. It was here, in the darkest, most claustrophobic heart of the storm, that the true nature of the Oda's terrifying resilience manifested, turning the relentless Sato advance into a sudden, bloody standstill. The relentless rain beat a frantic, deafening rhythm against lacquered helmets and iron breastplates, washing away the superficial dirt but never the profound, permanent stain of the day's massacre, as the monochrome world prepared for one final, monumental clash of opposing wills that would determine the ultimate fate of the entire province. Standing at the absolute epicenter of this sudden, violent blockage was General Honda, the very same brutally arrogant warlord who had spat venomous insults across the negotiation table weeks prior. He was a terrifying colossus, a giant of a man whose sheer physical mass seemed to warp the very air around him, anchoring the fleeing Oda troops with his terrifying, undeniable gravity.
Encased in incredibly heavy, black-lacquered domaru armor that greedily drank the scarce dying light of the stormy afternoon, he resembled a wrathful demon king violently ripped from the pages of forgotten, blood-soaked mythology. Cold rain cascaded off the fierce, golden-horned crest of his massive kabuto helmet, streaming relentlessly down the terrifying, snarling mempo faceplate that entirely hid his human features, leaving only his eyes, burning with a fanatical, cornered, and deeply murderous fury, visible to the trembling world. In his massive, heavily gauntleted hands he held a weapon of absurd, terrifying proportions, a colossal no-dachi, a field sword so impossibly long and thick it required the raw strength of 3 ordinary men merely to lift it from the dirt. Honda wielded this monstrous slab of iron with frightening, effortless ease, the dark, unpolished steel of the gigantic blade catching the dull ambient light and turning it into a chilling, absolute promise of imminent slaughter. The giant stood knee-deep in the churned, bloody black mud, a solitary, unyielding mountain of iron and wrath, utterly refusing to yield even a single inch to the overwhelming Sato tide. He did not issue frantic commands. His menacing presence alone, the low, guttural, beast-like growls escaping his iron mask, and the sheer, intimidating spread of his impossibly broad shoulder.
Chapter 16. The Unfurled Silence.
The roar of the battlefield, a cacophony of clashing steel, desperate screams, and thundering hooves that had consumed the world for what felt like an eternity, finally began to recede into a haunting, heavy quiet. The Sato clan emerged victorious, their banners still fluttering defiantly in the cold, damp wind, but the cost of their triumph was etched deeply into the scarred earth beneath their feet. A dense spectral fog began to roll down from the surrounding mountains, creeping over the trampled grass and intertwining with the lingering smoke of black powder and burning barricades, casting the entire landscape in a stark monochromatic pallor. This was a world drained of its vibrant hues, reduced to the brutal, high-contrast realities of ash, mud, and iron, reminiscent of a somber woodblock print brought to tragic life. The sky above was a tempestuous canvas of bruised purples and charcoal grays, threatening to unleash a torrential downpour that might wash away the sins of the day, yet holding back, as if demanding that the survivors bear witness to the carnage they had wrought. Flakes of ash, like dark snow, drifted lazily through the chilled air, settling upon the shoulders of the living and the unseeing eyes of the dead alike. The silence that unfurled across the valley was not the peaceful quiet of a serene morning, but a suffocating, almost physical weight that pressed down upon the chests of the exhausted warriors. It was a silence born of absolute devastation, a void left behind when the sheer volume of human violence had finally exhausted itself, leaving only the agonizing echoes of mortality in its wake. Within this vast, desolate theater of war, Kenshin stood as a solitary silhouette against the creeping mists, a singular focal point in a masterfully composed tableau of survival and sorrow. The earth beneath his straw sandals was churned into a treacherous paste of soil and spilled life, the mud sucking at his heels with every slight shift of his weight. He did not move to celebrate. He did not raise his voice in a triumphant cheer. Instead, he simply existed in the epicenter of the aftermath, a vessel emptied of adrenaline and filled with the profound, echoing realization that he had survived the crucible. The wind howled softly through the jagged peaks, a mournful dirge that seemed to carry the souls of the fallen into the ether, while Kenshin remained tethered to the mortal realm, anchored by the extreme physical toll of the battle and the heavy metallic tang of blood that coated his tongue and filled his nostrils.
Every breath he drew was a labored, burning effort, his chest heaving beneath the lacquered plates of his armor, each inhalation a testament to his continued existence in a field where so many had ceased to breathe. The immediate aftermath of the slaughter was a sensory assault of a different, more insidious nature, creeping into Kenshin's awareness as the blinding red haze of combat slowly evaporated from his vision. The profound stillness of the valley was continuously, tragically punctured by the wet, guttural groans of the wounded and the dying, a chorus of agony that rose from the mist like the desperate prayers of condemned men. These sounds were intimate and horrific, stripping away the glorious facade of samurai warfare to reveal the raw, trembling fragility of the human body when subjected to the merciless bite of sharpened steel. Kenshin's ears, still ringing with the high-pitched, metallic shriek of clashing katana blades and the concussive thuds of matchlock fire, now had to process the sickeningly soft noises of the aftermath. The wet tear of a bandage being hastily applied, the ragged coughing of a man drowning in his own blood, the soft thud of a dropped spear into the sodden earth. The scent of the battlefield was a complex, nauseating miasma that clung to his skin and hair, a potent mixture of rusted iron, voided bowers, crushed wild grasses, and the unmistakable sweet copper